Right now, in the forested hills northeast of the city of Verdun in northern France, there are approximately 12 million unexploded shells still in the ground. Not archaeological curiosities, not museum pieces, live ordnance, loaded with the same explosives, the same phosgene and arsenic-laced gas compounds that were packed into them in German and French munitions factories in 1915 and 1916. Sitting in the same chalk and clay where they fell, waiting with the patience that only inanimate objects can sustain. The French government has officially designated roughly 170 square kilometers of that land as the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, an area so chemically fractured, so threaded with buried metal and poison that farming it is illegal, building on it is illegal, and in some sectors, walking through it unaided is discouraged by signs that do not use polite language. 1 ton of explosive was detonated for every single square meter of contested ground around Verdun during the battle. The soil absorbed it. The soil is still absorbing the consequences. And the French government's current estimate for how long it will take to fully clear the Zone Rouge is somewhere between 300 and 700 years. That number, 300 to 700 years, is the one I keep returning to when I try to find a number that adequately describes what happened at Verdun between the 21st of February and the 18th of December 1916. Not the casualty count, though that number is devastating enough. Not the shells fired, though 60 million of them is a figure that defies ordinary comprehension. It's the 700 years. It's the fact that a single 10-month battle left a physical scar so deep in the earth that people alive in the year 2700 will still be dealing with it. You can talk about Verdun in terms of strategy, of command decisions, of French nationalism and German miscalculation. But the ground itself is the truest record of what happened there. It cannot be edited, reinterpreted, or revised. It just sits there, still warm with the residue of 1916, killing the occasional munitions removal worker who gets unlucky on a Tuesday afternoon a century later. The German plan for Verdun was conceived by Chief of General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn in late 1915, with a coldness that makes it remarkable in the history of military strategy. He was not primarily trying to capture Verdun. He was trying to use it. His reasoning, set out in what became known as the Christmas Memorandum, was that France would defend Verdun to the last man because of its symbolic and historical weight, which meant Germany could position its artillery on the high ground, force France to feed divisions into an enclosed killing ground, and drain the French army of men at a faster rate than Germany lost its own. To bleed France white. The specific phrase appears in the historical record, and it carries with it a quality that most military documents do not: the frank acknowledgement that the objective was not victory in any traditional sense, but the industrial manufacture of French death. Verdun was not designed as a battle. It was designed as a mechanism. At 7:15 in the morning on February the 21st, 1916, 808 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 8-mile front. 2 million shells were fired in the opening bombardment alone, more than had ever been concentrated in a single engagement in the history of warfare to that point. A French soldier who survived the opening hours later described it as the ground itself standing up and walking. The bombardment lasted 9 hours before German infantry moved forward across terrain so thoroughly churned that the landscape men had been defending a day earlier was no longer recognizable as the same place. Within 4 days, the German advance had fractured the French outer defensive lines. On the 25th of February, Fort Douaumont, the largest of the 19 forts protecting Verdun, a structure of concrete and steel that the French had trusted as their anchor, was entered and occupied by a German raiding party of just 19 officers and 79 men, who found an open window in the moat and climbed through it. No French defenders were present in sufficient numbers to stop them. The fall of Fort Douaumont, taken without a serious fight by fewer than 100 men, sent a psychological shock through the French army and French government that the next 10 months of the battle would be organized around reversing. The man France sent to reverse it was General Philippe Pétain, and the first thing he did was look at a map and understand that the battle would be decided not by heroics, but by arithmetic, specifically by whether France could move enough men and shells up a single 72-kilometer road from the town of Bar-le-Duc to the front lines. That road, the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, became the circulatory system of the entire French war effort at Verdun. 3,500 trucks ran it continuously, day and night, in convoys spaced so tightly that the road could not stop for any reason. A truck that broke down was pushed off the edge by the one behind it, and the convoy continued. At its peak, a vehicle passed a given point on that road every 14 seconds. Pétain also introduced a rotation system, the Noria, that cycled French divisions in and out of Verdun, so no single unit stayed long enough to collapse entirely. At one point, 70% of the entire French army had rotated through Verdun. The battle consumed France so completely that it effectively became France's entire war for 10 months. The village of Fleury, which sat in the contested zone between the two armies, changed hands 16 times between June and August of 1916. 16 times. The same small cluster of buildings, or what remained of them after the first few exchanges, was taken and retaken and taken again across 2 months of summer fighting. Today, Fleury does not exist as an inhabited place. 9 villages around Verdun were so completely obliterated during the battle that the French government decided not to rebuild them. They remain on official records with a listed population of 0, their street plans preserved as outlines in the forest floor, their church bells gone, their residents either dead or resettled elsewhere. The land where they stood is designated as permanently belonging to the dead. Across the entire 302 days the battle ran, France suffered 377,231 casualties. Germany suffered 337,000. An average of 70,000 men were killed each month, roughly 2,300 every single day, across a corridor of land that, at its widest, stretched barely 8 miles. Both sides bled at nearly the same rate, which is the particular obscenity at the core of Verdun. The mechanism Falkenhayn designed to drain France also drained Germany, at roughly equal speed, and by the time the battle ground to a stop in December, both armies had been eroded to a point that neither could fully recover from before 1917 arrived with its own disasters. There is still a great deal of this story that the video hasn't yet opened. The specific moments inside the battle where the line between French collapse and French survival was measured in hours. The German tactical recalibrations after the Somme opened in July and pulled pressure away from Verdun, and the question of what Falkenhayn's plan actually achieved, which is more complicated and more interesting than a simple, "it failed." We're going to go through all of it. If you're finding that your eyes are already doing their own thing, drifting, softening, the room going comfortable and dark, then let the story carry you. Verdun is the kind of history that doesn't require you to be alert to feel the weight of it. It sits differently at night. Some things do. So settle in wherever you are. This is the entire history of the Battle of Verdun. Chapter 1. The Memo That May Not Exist. There is a document that started a battle that lasted 302 days, consumed perhaps 700,000 men, and poisoned roughly 1,200 square kilometers of French soil so thoroughly that you still cannot safely walk on parts of it. That document, a memorandum written, supposedly, on Christmas Eve of 1915 by the German Chief of the General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, is the founding text of everything that follows in this series. It is the explanation for why Verdun happened, why those specific ridges, that specific river, those specific villages, were chosen as the location for the most sustained act of industrial killing in human history. There is only one problem. No one has ever found the original copy. The Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg holds the surviving records of the Imperial German Army. Researchers have spent decades working through those files, the war diaries, the operational orders, the strategic correspondence of the German High Command. The folder where the Falkenhayn Memorandum should logically sit, if it was written and sent as described, does not contain it. The historian Paul Jankowski, in his careful study of Verdun, published in the early 2000s, put it plainly. The famous Christmas memorandum, he wrote, has never been found. We know it exists in only one place. In Falkenhayn's own memoir, published in 1919, 1 year after Germany's defeat, when Falkenhayn had already been dismissed, already humiliated, already stripped of his command. He included the text of the memo in that book. He is the only source for it. This matters enormously, and I want to be direct about why. The Christmas Memorandum is the document that gave Verdun its intellectual framework. It's the source of the famous phrase, "Bleed France white." It's the text that historians have cited for a century to explain why Falkenhayn chose Verdun rather than a dozen other possible points of attack. If the document is authentic, then Verdun was a calculated act of strategic attrition. A coldly rational decision to select a place so symbolically important to France that she would throw her armies into defending it and then destroy those armies. If the document was written after the fact, then Verdun was something messier and more human. A conventional offensive that failed, dressed up afterward in the language of strategic genius. The word he chose for the operation is itself a problem. Falkenhayn called it Gericht. English language historians have translated this as place of execution or execution ground for over a century, and the phrase lands with satisfying grimness in every documentary, every school textbook, every museum caption. The Germans named their slaughter operation the execution ground. Except that's not quite what Gericht means. In German, Gericht means judgment or court in the judicial sense. It's the word on a courthouse door. The apocalyptic execution ground reading is a mistranslation, and it's been repeated so often, in so many languages, for so long, that it has hardened into fact. The operation was named Judgment. That's different. That's almost more disturbing, in a quieter way, than execution ground. Because judgment implies a verdict, and a verdict implies that someone decided the accused was guilty. Of what? Of being French? Historian Robert Foley, in his 1999 study, German Strategy and the Path to Verdun, made the crucial observation that the operational orders actually issued to the German Fifth Army in early February of 1916, the orders that set the battle in motion, do not describe a pure attrition strategy. They emphasize the capture of the Verdun fortresses. They read like a conventional breakthrough offensive, with territorial objectives and phase lines. Holger Afflerbach, speaking at the German Historical Institute in London in the early 2000s, argued that the evidence, read honestly, supports a German attack conceived as a conventional operation, one that Falkenhayn later retroactively reframed as a sophisticated attrition strategy when it became clear that no breakthrough had been achieved and the casualties were mounting to catastrophic levels on both sides. What Falkenhayn appears to have done is this. He fought a failing battle for most of 1916, was dismissed in August of that year, after Germany suffered near-simultaneous disasters at Verdun and the Somme, and then, in the relative quiet of retirement, wrote a memoir that transformed his failures into a plan. The plan he described was actually quite elegant. It was also, most likely, invented. That is the founding document of the Battle of Verdun. It's a story a disgraced general told about himself. Crown Prince Wilhelm, who commanded the German Fifth Army that carried out the assault, wrote in his own memoir, Meine Erinnerungen, published in 1923, that he consistently pushed for an attack on both banks of the Meuse River simultaneously. The French had artillery positions on the left bank that could fire directly into the German assault corridor on the right bank. It was a basic geometrical problem. If you're attacking east and northeast, and the enemy has guns positioned to your left and slightly ahead, those guns will tear apart the flank of every wave you send forward. The Crown Prince saw this. His army commanders saw this. Falkenhayn apparently refused to extend the attack, reportedly because he feared overcommitting forces. The result was that from the very first weeks of the battle, German assault divisions were being shredded by artillery fire from a direction they couldn't neutralize, and the battle began consuming German soldiers at a rate that bore no resemblance to the theory of controlled, calibrated French bloodletting that the Christmas Memorandum described. There's a diplomatic register I keep returning to when I think about the Christmas Memorandum problem. It involves a kind of careful, institutional language, and it goes like this. The document's authenticity remains a subject of scholarly discussion. That's how you say it in an academic journal. What it means, in plain English, is that the most cited explanation for one of the worst battles in the history of human warfare is written on paper that may have been blank until 1919. It means that a century of school curricula, exhibition panels, documentary films, and published histories have been built on a strategic framework that a fired general may have invented to protect his reputation. And it means we should hold everything that follows in this series with a certain provisional humility. Because if the reason for the battle is uncertain, then everything that happened within it needs to be looked at again. The Kaiser's private correspondence from early 1916, preserved at the Haus Hohenzollern, shows genuine dynastic enthusiasm for the operation. Wilhelm II wanted his eldest son commanding a great offensive. The choice of Verdun as the target may have been shaped as much by that dynastic calculation, the Crown Prince needed a stage, as by any calculated strategic theory. The personal and the political were not separable in the courts of the German Empire in ways that military historians have sometimes found inconvenient to acknowledge. The Christmas Memorandum describes a rational chess player planning several moves ahead. The letters and diaries from the same period describe something closer to a family argument about prestige. For the German army, the logistical preparation for the attack was itself extraordinary, whatever its strategic rationale. In the 6 weeks before the assault opened on the 21st of February, 1916, the Germans moved approximately 2.5 million shells to forward supply depots along the Verdun front. 2.5 million. The weight of that ammunition alone exceeded 50,000 tons, which required something in the order of 1,300 rail wagon movements across a rail network that was simultaneously supporting operations on 2 other major fronts. You don't do that for an improvised idea. The planning was real, the commitment was enormous, and the operational machinery that was assembled was the largest artillery concentration in the history of warfare to that point. Whatever Falkenhayn intended, and we genuinely don't know, the German army executed with appalling professionalism. Chapter 2. Fortress on Paper. To understand what happened at Verdun, you have to understand what Verdun actually was. Not as a symbol, not as a myth, but as a physical structure. A ring of concrete and steel built into the limestone ridges above the Meuse River. 43 forts and smaller fortifications arranged in 2 concentric arcs, with the city at the center. The outer ring ran roughly 8 kilometers from the city walls. The inner ring was tighter still. In the years before the war, European military architects and visiting attachés from a dozen foreign armies regarded the Verdun fortified complex as among the most formidable defensive works on Earth. They weren't entirely wrong. The problem is that by the time the German attack opened in February of 1916, the fortresses had been systematically gutted by the army that was supposed to defend them. Fort Douaumont was the crown of the system. Built between 1884 and 1886, modernized with reinforced concrete in the years up to 1913. It sat on the dominant ridge northeast of Verdun, with observation over virtually every approach. Its concrete roof, in the finished form, was 2.5 meters thick, capped with additional layers of sand and earth designed to absorb and detonate incoming shells before they could transfer their energy into the structure below. German siege engineers had calculated that their largest howitzer, the 42-centimeter Krupp piece that had pulverized the Belgian forts at Liège in 1914, could penetrate a maximum of about 2.2 meters of reinforced concrete per direct strike. Douaumont, in theory, was proof against even this. Inside the fort, steel-plated rotating gun turrets could rise from their armored housings to fire, and then retract below the parapet line between shots. 250 tons of steel, hydraulically operated, capable of disappearing into the earth like something that has decided it doesn't want to be shot at. Formidable. Genuinely formidable. What it wasn't, by February of 1916, was manned. The experience at Liège in August of 1914 had shaken the French military establishment badly. Belgian forts that had been considered modern and near impregnable had been reduced to rubble by German heavy artillery within days. General Joffre, commanding the French armies, drew what seemed at the time like a reasonable lesson. Concrete forts were death traps. They were fixed, they were obvious, and the Germans had the guns to smash them. Better to strip the fortresses of their heavy artillery, which was desperately needed elsewhere on the active front, and concentrate on flexible, mobile defense. It wasn't an irrational decision, given what Joffre had seen. But it was a decision that was made without anyone apparently thinking through what it meant for Verdun specifically. There was a man who did think it through. His name was Émile Drian. Lieutenant Colonel Drian was a remarkable figure in ways that become tragic the more closely you look at him. A military man turned parliamentarian, elected to the Chamber of Deputies, who had used his dual position to spend years warning anyone who would listen that Verdun's defences were being neglected. From the summer of 1915 onward, Drian, who was actually stationed in the Verdun sector, commanding 2 battalions of chasseurs à pied in a wood called the Bois des Cours, sent formal reports to the Ministry of War, predicting that the sector was dangerously exposed. He had connections. He used them. The warnings were acknowledged. They were not acted upon. General Hare, commanding the fortified region of Verdun, made the same argument through official channels. His requests for reinforcement of the fort's garrisons in the autumn and winter of 1915 are preserved in the archives at Vincennes. He asked for men, for ammunition stockpiles, for the return of some of the artillery that had been taken away. French General Headquarters post-war official history claims that Joffre had been adequately briefed on Verdun's defensive state. Hare's own testimony, given after the war, says flatly that he was overruled. Those two accounts cannot both be entirely true, and the fact that the disagreement exists in the record is itself a piece of evidence about how the French army processed inconvenient information in the winter of 1915 to 1916. By the time the Germans attacked, Fort Douaumont, the strongest fortification in the entire French defensive network, the fort that was supposed to anchor the whole system, was garrisoned by fewer than 60 men. The precise figure varies slightly by source. The most commonly cited is approximately 57 territorial infantrymen, most of them older men deemed unfit for active frontline service. They were there to maintain the equipment, the turret mechanisms, the communications cables, the stores. They weren't there to fight a division. They weren't equipped to fight a division. Nobody had told them they might need to fight a division, because the official position was that Verdun's forward trench lines would stop any German advance long before it reached the fort. Those forward trench lines had also been neglected. Me trying to explain the specific arithmetic of Douaumont's garrison to people who haven't read the French engineering records is a bit like trying to describe a car crash by reading out the safety inspection forms. The numbers sound technical until you remember what they mean. 75 artillery pieces had been removed from Douaumont. 57 old men were left behind. That's the calculation. And in Paris, in the autumn of 1915, some official somewhere looked at those numbers and decided they were acceptable. On the 25th of February, 1916, 4 days after the German assault began, a German sergeant named Kunze of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment crawled through an unguarded drainage channel into the fort's outer works. What followed was not a battle. It was a sequence of encounters in darkened corridors, in which Kunze, and then small groups of Germans who followed him in, worked through the interior of the fort, gathering the garrison's defenders, one or two at a time. Kunze's own account of the capture, preserved in the German military archive, describes locating French soldiers in the fort's lower levels, men sheltering from the bombardment above, with no particular idea that Germans were already inside the walls. The most important fortress in France fell without a pitched defensive action, in approximately 2 hours, to a small group of men who found an unlocked door. In Berlin, church bells rang. German newspapers declared it a triumph of arms. French prisoners being marched east heard the German soldiers celebrating. Colonel Drian was already dead by then. He was killed on the 22nd of February, the second day of the German assault, while covering the retreat of the survivors of his 2 chasseur battalions from the Bois de Cour. His command had absorbed the initial impact of the German attack in that sector. Fewer than 1,300 men against 4 full German regiments. They held for 2 days, suffering roughly 90% casualties. 2 days of holding in the Bois de Cour bought the French army time that was directly used to rush reserves toward Verdun before the German advance could reach the city. Military historians now generally accept that Drian's stand in the Bois de Cour disrupted the German operational timetables so significantly that the intended rapid breakthrough never occurred. His defense wasn't planned as a delaying action. It became one because his men simply refused to stop fighting until they couldn't anymore. The man who had spent years in Parliament warning that Verdun's defences were inadequate died in the woods, proving himself right. He never knew that the forts he'd argued for were already empty. The mechanical details of the Douaumont turret system are worth understanding because they underscore quite precisely what had been abandoned. The 155mm Borge turret, the main armament of the fort, was a rotating steel cupola capable of bringing its gun to bear across a wide arc, then retracting the entire assembly below the parapet between shots. The hydraulic mechanism that operated this ran on a system of hand-pumped pressure accumulators. No electricity required, no external power source. Theoretically, a small and determined crew could operate the turret and maintain fire for extended periods with only the fort's internal resources. In 1913, the fort had the crews to do this. By February of 1916, it had a skeleton maintenance party who mostly used the tunnels for shelter. The turret sat in its armoured housing, fully operational, untouched by German shell fire, and fired not a single round during the battle that determined the fate of the fort. The post-war French official history is notably careful in how it discusses the decisions that left Verdun's forts unmanned. It uses passive constructions. Things had been removed. Decisions had been taken. No specific officer's name appears in the key passages about the garrison reductions. This is the language of institutional self-protection, the linguistic equivalent of a fire investigation report that describes a building that burned down without mentioning who turned off the sprinklers. Verdun was not lost to German strength alone. It was very nearly lost to French institutional failure, and the near loss happened before the first German shell landed. Chapter 3. The Day the Earth Spoke. At 7:15 in the morning on the 21st of February 1916, the German artillery opened fire along a front of roughly 40 kilometers. There was a silence first. Survivors described it later. Something on the order of 30 seconds, perhaps less, perhaps a minute, where the morning held itself still before the whole horizon convulsed. Men in the French forward positions had been under intermittent German artillery fire for days. The Germans had been registering their guns, finding their ranges, calibrating what was to come. But this was different in quality from the moment it began. The opening barrage was not the escalation of something familiar. It was a new category of event. A French captain whose account is preserved among the witness testimonies at the Memorial de Verdun later wrote, "I have returned from the most terrible ordeal I have ever witnessed. 4 days and 4 nights, 96 hours, the last 2 days without water, without food." He was describing the aftermath, but the voice carries the imprint of the beginning. What began on the 21st of February wasn't an artillery bombardment in any sense that anyone standing on that ridge in 1916 had previously experienced. It was approximately 1 million shells fired along 40 kilometers of front in under 9 hours. Work out what that means in terms of rhythm. Roughly 31 shells per second across the entire front, which translates to something like 1 shell landing every 3 or 4 seconds within every 100-meter stretch of trench line. Not an event, a condition. The term German artillerists used was Trommelfeuer, drum fire. The word is both accurate and insufficient. It was accurate because the overlapping impacts created something like a continuous percussion, not the pause and crash of ordinary artillery, but a sustained roar in which individual detonations ceased to be distinguishable. It was insufficient because drum fire implies rhythm, and what men in the French forward positions experienced was closer to the sound and physical pressure of being inside an engine. Multiple survivor accounts describe the ground moving, not shaking, moving, in a slow, continuous heave, as though the earth itself was trying to get away from what was being done to it. Men in concrete bunkers were knocked unconscious by concussive overpressure without being physically touched. They woke with no sense of how much time had passed. Some of them wrote afterward that they couldn't hear speech from a person standing 1 meter away for hours after the bombardment lifted. Not deafness exactly, but a quality of acoustic damage that left sound arriving as vibration rather than distinct signal. The logistical feat behind the bombardment is worth a moment's attention, because it's easy to think of artillery preparation as simply a lot of guns shooting. The February 21st fire plan required more than 1,200 German guns to maintain coordinated rates of fire across a 40-kilometer front, all timed through telephone communication to maintain the overlapping impact density that produced the drumfire effect. This was a signals achievement as much as an artillery achievement. Maintaining synchronized fire from batteries separated by kilometers, adjusting for barrel wear during the bombardment, preventing gaps in the shell density through which defenders might move. This required planning of a very specific and technically demanding kind. The Germans were better prepared for this than any army had ever been. They'd been practicing, in smaller ways, for 2 years. In the Bois de Cour, Lieutenant Colonel Driant's 2 battalions of chasseurs had spent months building their positions specifically against the anticipation of a German assault. Driant had been warning about this since the previous August. His men had constructed multiple lines of positions in the wood, connected by communication trenches, with shelters deep enough to give some protection against anything short of a direct hit by heavy caliber. The shelters were not enough. Survivor accounts from the Bois de Cour describe the specific experience of hearing the shelters cracking under impact, the sound of reinforced overhead cover responding to near misses, the way dust fell from the joints between timbers, the way the candles guttered when a heavy shell landed within 30 meters. Men who emerged from their shelters between impacts to check on their sections found the landscape around them unrecognizable after less than an hour of bombardment. What the German barrage was designed to do, technically, was not simply to destroy the French positions. It was to prevent any movement or communication between them. This is the Trommelfeuer concept applied doctrinally. If your artillery can maintain a density of impact that makes movement through the target area suicidal at any point during the bombardment, you don't just destroy what's in the area, you isolate every element of it from every other element. A position that can't communicate with its neighbors and can't be reinforced becomes a problem. It doesn't matter how many men are in it. The drumfire wasn't trying to kill everyone in the Bois de Cour. It was trying to make the Bois de Cour into a collection of separate, isolated, deaf pockets of men, each unable to know what was happening 50 meters away. This worked. In the specific technical sense, it worked extraordinarily well. By mid-morning on the 21st, French unit commanders in the bombardment zone had lost telephone communication with one another and with the rear. Runners sent between positions encountered bombardment of such density that most couldn't get through. Officers making decisions in the frontline shelters were doing so without reliable information about what was happening anywhere outside their immediate field of view, which was, in any case, obscured by smoke, dust, and debris. Command and control had not broken down. It had been deliberately destroyed. There is a specific disagreement in the sources here that I find genuinely revealing. German regimental war diaries from the 21st of February record the bombardment as lasting from just after 7:15 in the morning until approximately 4 in the afternoon, followed by a brief infantry probe at dusk. This is 9 hours. French survivor accounts from the Bois de Cour consistently describe German infantry approaching before the barrage had fully lifted, or describe being attacked simultaneously with ongoing bombardment in their sector. It's possible that both accounts are accurate and describe different parts of a 40-kilometer front. It's also possible that under bombardment of this intensity, French witnesses experienced significant temporal distortion, the neurological effect of sustained concussive exposure on the human brain's ability to sequence and time events. 18 months of study of the medical literature on blast exposure suggests to me that this second explanation is probably part of the answer. Men who have been concussed repeatedly don't keep accurate time. And by mid-afternoon on the 21st of February, most of the men in the forward positions had been concussed repeatedly. The Germans used Stoßtruppen tactics in their first infantry probe at the end of the day. Small groups of assault troops advancing by infiltration under the cover of ongoing artillery, rather than the broad infantry waves that dominated early Western Front thinking. This is a detail that tends to be buried in accounts focused primarily on the artillery spectacle, but it matters operationally. The German assault on February 21st wasn't using the doctrinal approach that had characterized German attacks of 1914 and 1915. Something had been learned and applied. The small group infiltration tactics that would define the massive German offensive of March 1918 were being tested and refined here, in the failing light of the first day at Verdun. Drion's chasseurs held, not because they had specific orders to hold to the last man, though they fought as if they did, but because the positions Drion had built were good enough, and because the men in them were professional soldiers who understood that every hour they held was an hour the French army had to respond to what was happening. By the time night came on the 21st, the German advance had been slowed significantly on the Bois de Cour axis. Not stopped, not defeated, but slowed. The 2-day delay that Drion's command ultimately purchased is now regarded as one of the most consequential tactical actions of the entire 10-month battle. French reserves were moving toward Verdun. Pétain would arrive to take command of the sector. The logistical response that would become the Voie Sacrée was beginning to be assembled. None of this would have been possible if the German advance had moved at the pace the operational plan assumed. The men who fought in the Bois de Cour on the 21st and 22nd of February suffered casualties that are almost impossible to think about steadily. Of approximately 1,300 chasseurs, fewer than a few hundred came out intact. Most of the survivors were wounded. Drian was killed on the second day, shot while covering his men's withdrawal through the wood. He died in the trees he had spent months preparing, defending the position he had spent years in Parliament warning his government to reinforce. There's a specific cruelty to that coincidence. The man who was right about everything, arriving in time to prove it personally. What contemporary neuroscience now identifies in the survivor accounts from the Bois de Cour is a textbook presentation of blast-induced traumatic brain injury. Loss of consciousness without a direct physical impact. Temporal disorientation. Prolonged auditory suppression. Dissociative gaps in memory. These were not cowardice, not weakness, not the shell shock that the military establishments of both sides regarded with varying degrees of suspicion and contempt. They were the predictable neurological consequence of sustained exposure to concussive overpressure. The men in the Bois de Cour were experiencing a category of injury that medicine wouldn't have a name for until the 21st century. They were experiencing it in a wood in the Meuse Valley in February of 1916, while trying to hold a line against 4 German regiments for a chain of command that didn't yet know it needed them to hold. Chapter 4. The Road That Breathed. When Pétain arrived at Souilly on the 25th of February 1916 to take command of the Verdun sector, the first thing he did was not issue tactical orders. He asked for a logistics report. This detail, small, procedural, entirely undramatic, tells you more about Pétain as a commander than most of the things that have been written about him. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had studied and practiced war for 40 years, that the battle had already been shaped by a physical fact before a single tactical decision had been made. There was one road running from the railhead at Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, 56 kilometers of secondary departmental highway, not designed for military loads, not maintained to military standards. The road was France. If it failed, Verdun fell. It was that simple. The situation he inherited was worse than that bare description suggests. The narrow-gauge railway connecting Verdun to the French rail network was capable of moving approximately 2,000 tons of supplies per day. The army at Verdun needed somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 tons daily to sustain combat operations. Ammunition, food, engineering materials, medical supplies, replacement troops. The railway was delivering roughly 1/8 of that. The road made up the difference. And the road was already deteriorating under the loads it was carrying, because it had been built for farm carts and civilian traffic, not for endless columns of 2-ton military trucks running 24 hours a day in February mud. The road had to be rebuilt while it was being used. This is not a metaphor. This is what actually happened. The solution, devised and implemented within days of Pétain taking command, was to organize the road as if it were a production line rather than a highway. Approximately 8,500 territorial workers were mobilized and distributed along the road's length in rotating sections, each section responsible for a defined stretch of approximately 5 kilometers. Crushed limestone, macadam, was stockpiled at 500-meter intervals along the road's length. When a section of the surface deteriorated below a functional threshold, the workers moved in with the stockpiled aggregate and rebuilt it. Then the trucks continued over the fresh surface. Then the surface deteriorated again. Then the workers came back. Around the clock, 7 days a week, for 10 months. The specific road maintenance technique used was adapted from the principles of classical road building. The surface was maintained with a slight convex camber, highest in the center, falling away to the verges, so that rainwater drained off rather than pooling and saturating the roadbed. This sounds simple. In practice, maintaining this profile under constant heavy traffic in wet conditions required constant labor, skilled supervision, and an uninterrupted supply of aggregate material. The road was not a static infrastructure asset. It was a living system that required continuous investment of human effort simply to continue existing. The trucks themselves were mostly Berlier CBA models, 2-ton capacity, reliable, and just simple enough to be maintained by drivers without specialist mechanical training. The Berlier factory in Lyon, responsive to emergency war ministry orders, was producing approximately 40 vehicles per day by mid-1916. The convoys that ran the road operated with timed intervals, trucks moving in column with carefully managed spacing, the intervals timed so that a vehicle passed a given point every 14 seconds at peak operation. Headlights were masked to narrow slits for night running. Trucks that broke down were pushed off the road without ceremony, not repaired in place, not waited for, just moved to the verge so the column behind could keep moving. The road's momentum was non-negotiable. Post-war accounts, including Pétain's own memoir, describe the Voie Sacrée carrying 6,000 trucks per day at its peak. This figure has been reproduced in virtually every English-language account of Verdun for more than a century. It appears in museum displays, in school textbooks, in documentary narrations. The logistical records preserved in the French military archives at Vincennes suggest the actual peak figure was closer to 3,900 individual vehicles per day, with the 6,000 figure appearing to count total individual passengers rather than individual trucks, since many vehicles made multiple runs. This is not a trivial discrepancy. It doesn't diminish the achievement. Moving 3,900 trucks per day along a single deteriorating road through the French countryside is an extraordinary feat of organization and will. But the difference matters because the inflated figure has never been seriously questioned in popular history, which tells you something about how deeply the Verdun myth has embedded itself. During the initial crisis period, from the 21st of February to the 22nd of March alone, the road delivered approximately 48,000 tons of ammunition and 6,400 tons of other supplies to the Verdun sector. That's from the French official history. Over the full 10 months of the battle, the Voie Sacrée moved something in the order of 500,000 tons of materiel and transported more than 2 million French soldiers to or from the front. The road moved the equivalent of a small country's annual industrial output through a single corridor of limestone and clay. There were approximately 500,000 individual truck journeys. 500,000. I drove that road once, before I started working on this project. Or rather, I drove the modern version of it, the D1916, which the French government renamed in the 1990s to mark the road's historical significance. It takes about 40 minutes from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun. On a clear day, through the gentle hills of the Meuse, it's an entirely ordinary piece of French countryside. Farms, fields, church spires in the middle distances. It took genuine effort of imagination to superimpose onto that quiet landscape the reality that for 10 months in 1916, the physical survival of France as a functioning military power passed through those specific kilometers of tarmac. And then I stopped trying to imagine it, because I'd looked at the logistical records, and I knew it was just true. There was an incident recorded in German artillery after-action reports from late March of 1916 that gives the vulnerability of the road a specific, awful shape. A column of trucks, delayed by a surface collapse in the road, backed up across roughly 3 kilometers. Visible, stationary, in daylight, within range of German long-range guns. German artillery observers located the column and reported it. The guns responded. Within approximately 20 minutes, 47 vehicles were destroyed. The survivors of the column drove around the burning hulks and continued toward Verdun. The road had to keep moving. It couldn't afford to stop for its own dead. The men who ran the voies sacrées, the drivers, the road repair crews, the engineers, the logistics officers, formed what was in effect a third army, invisible in every casualty list and absent from every order of battle. They moved more tonnage than the artillery consumed. They transported more men than any single division. They are commemorated by nothing at Verdun. There is no monument to the territorial worker who patched the road surface while trucks drove past him at 3 in the morning in freezing rain. There is no museum display devoted to the 8,500 men who kept the limestone aggregate flowing. The Voie Sacrée has a museum at one end and a commemorative marker at the other. But the men who made it work are in no particular registry of heroism, which is the peculiar injustice that attaches itself to logistical genius in wartime. It's only visible when it fails. The road's survival depended on one more thing that tends to get overlooked: the weather held in March and April of 1916. A prolonged period of heavy rain in those months, of the kind that turned the Somme battlefield into soup 7 months later, would have destroyed the road surface faster than any repair crew could have managed. The road worked, in the end, partly because Pétain organized it brilliantly, and partly because the Meuse Valley had a dry enough spring that year to allow it to work. Military history is full of moments where competent planning and adequate weather converged at the right time, and historians tend to give the competence all the credit. The weather at Verdun in the spring of 1916 was not heroic, but it wasn't nothing either. Chapter 5. The Spreadsheet of the Dead. Somewhere in the archives at Vincennes, in the papers of the French Army's statistical section from 1917, there is a marginal note in pencil in the draft of an official casualty report. The note, written by an unnamed staff officer reviewing the figures, says, "Ces chiffres sont impossibles à vérifier. Nous estimons." Which translates precisely, "These figures cannot be verified. We are estimating." That sentence, those 9 words in a pencil margin, is the most honest document produced by any official body in connection with the Battle of Verdun. It is also the document that has been most comprehensively ignored in a century of historical writing about the battle, because it says something about the nature of industrial warfare that is deeply uncomfortable to accept. How many people died at Verdun? The answer depends on who you ask and when. The Memorial de Verdun, the primary memorial institution, states 163,000 French dead and 143,000 German dead, figures derived from a careful reading of official French and German records. The French official history, published in the 1920s, gives different figures. The German Reichsarchive history, also published in that decade, gives different figures again. The historian William Philpott, writing in 2014, calculated approximately 714,000 total casualties for both sides combined. The memorial itself, in other publications, gives a combined total of almost 700,000 killed or injured. These are not small discrepancies between accounts that broadly agree. They describe different wars. The range of disagreement between the most serious published estimates spans hundreds of thousands of people. If you rounded to the nearest 100,000, you still couldn't say with confidence which 100,000 you were rounding to. This matters, and it matters for reasons that go beyond historiographical precision. The numbers are contested not because historians are careless, but because the nature of the battle itself made reliable counting impossible in ways that have never been fully acknowledged in the popular accounts. Consider first the problem of what the French army called disparus, the missing. At Verdun, where German and French estimates both agree that artillery fire caused approximately 70% of all fatal casualties, a significant proportion of the men killed by that artillery were killed in ways that left insufficient remains for any kind of identification. Men were struck by shells of 200 millimeters or more in caliber. Men were buried alive by the impact of heavy rounds detonating in soft ground next to their positions and were never recovered. Men died in positions that were then subjected to further bombardment before any recovery was possible. The category of missing contains within it an unknown but substantial number of men who simply cease to exist as recoverable physical entities. Then there's the Noria problem. Petain's rotation system, which was operationally essential and probably the single most important factor in sustaining French defensive capacity at Verdun, created a statistical nightmare for anyone trying to count casualties. By the end of the battle, approximately 70 of France's then 95 infantry divisions had passed through the Verdun sector. A man wounded in one division, evacuated, recovered, returned to service in a different division, and wounded again appears in the records of two different formations. The French statistical section estimated in its own internal working documents that double counting of this kind introduced a recording error of somewhere between 8 and 12% into French casualty totals. That's a potential inflation of 30,000 to 45,000 phantom casualties in the official figures, arising directly from the organizational logic of the Noria. The German figures have a different but equally serious problem. The Reichsarchive history was drafted in the 1920s under the supervision of former German high command officers, men with personal and institutional interests in how the war was remembered. The historian Hermann Wendt, working independently in 1931 and using individual regimental records rather than army-level summaries, arrived at German casualties in the Verdun sector approximately 90,000 higher than the Reichsarchive total. 90,000. That isn't a rounding error. That's a systematic pattern of underreporting German losses relative to French ones. A pattern that serves the narrative in which Germany bled France white by consistently making German losses appear smaller than French losses in the official record. If Wendt's regimental level analysis is correct, German casualties at Verdun may have exceeded French casualties, which would mean the strategic rationale of the Christmas memorandum, if that document even existed, achieved precisely the opposite of its stated goal. There's a further category that has been quietly excluded from virtually every published total: psychiatric casualties. The French army in 1916 classified what we would now recognize as combat stress reactions under the heading of troubles nerveux, nervous disorders, and these were systematically excluded from combat casualty totals until at least 1917. A retrospective analysis based on the available French medical records suggests that including troubles nerveux evacuations in the Verdun casualty count would add somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 cases. These were men who were evacuated from Verdun, unable to function as soldiers, some of them permanently. They don't appear in any monument. They weren't counted. The nature of their injury made them administratively invisible. Of an estimated 60 million shells fired at Verdun across the 10 months of the battle, 60 million, a number that I find I can type but cannot quite hold in my mind as a real quantity. Approximately 15 million failed to detonate on impact, a dud rate of roughly 1 in 4. Those 15 million shells are still in the soil of the Verdun sector. The combined weight of unexploded ordnance in the Zone Rouge is currently estimated at approximately 12 million kilograms. The French Service de Déminage, the bomb disposal service, recovers approximately 900 tons of this material every year. At that rate, complete clearance would take approximately 700 years. The dead are still armed. The battle is still happening, chemically and physically, in the soil. The Douaumont ossuary, that great pale building on the ridge above the battlefield, visible from kilometers away in every direction, is often described as a monument to the dead of Verdun. This is true, but incomplete. It is also a practical solution to an arithmetic problem. After the war, when the cleared battlefield yielded up its dead, There were so many body fragments in states of such advanced decomposition and fragmentation that positive identification was simply impossible for the vast majority of remains. The ossuary was built to store them. The bones of approximately 130,000 French and German soldiers lie in the vaulted chambers beneath the main hall, sorted by the section of the battlefield from which they were recovered, but not by nationality or identity. You can see them through small windows set in the outer wall. Femurs, tibias, skulls, ribs, all commingled in the dim interior. The ossuary continues to receive new additions. As recently as 2024, construction and agricultural work in the Verdun sector was still yielding remains. The building is still growing. I've spent a long time looking at the casualty figures for this battle, across multiple sources, in multiple languages, and the marginal note in the statistics section draft, "we are estimating," seems to me more important than any of the specific numbers it accompanies. Every historian, every memorial institution, every documentary has been estimating. The difference is that the man who wrote that note in 1917 knew it, in the specific, exhausted, pencil in the margin way of someone who has been staring at contradictory columns of numbers for weeks, and has finally written down the thing that the columns are actually telling him. The figures cannot be verified. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is a description of the kind of war Verdun was. A war in which men were dissolved by industrial chemistry at a rate and in circumstances that no recording system could have tracked, because the recording system was also being dissolved. What you put on a monument when you can't verify the numbers is its own kind of question. The Mémorial de Verdun gives you the most careful published estimate, which is also the most honest acknowledgement that it is an estimate. Other memorials give you rounded figures that project a confidence the archives do not support. The ossuary gives you something different, and in some ways more honest than any number. It gives you the actual bones, sorted by location and placed in the dark, and it declines to tell you anything about them except where they were found. Chapter 6. Fort Vaux, Letters to a Deaf God. On the 4th of June, 1916, a carrier pigeon left Fort Vaux carrying the last message Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal was able to send to the outside world. Raynal had been commanding the fort's garrison since the 1st of June, when German troops had reached the superstructure and begun working their way into the fort's interior. By the 4th, his telephone lines were cut, his runners couldn't get through, and his last 3 pigeons were all that remained of his communications with the French rear. The message the pigeon carried read, in French, "We are still holding, but we are in very reduced contact with our flanking posts. Take the necessary measures to communicate with us by airplane. This is our last pigeon." The pigeon arrived at its loft. Both its eyes had been burned by gas. It died within minutes of landing. The message was received. The relief never came in time. Raynal published his account of the siege, Le Drame du Fort de Vaux, in 1919, and it remains one of the most specific, verifiable first-person accounts of close-quarters siege warfare in the entire literature of the First World War. He wrote with the precision of a professional soldier. He recorded dates, times, specific quantities, names of men. He was not writing for effect. He was writing what happened. This specificity is what makes his account so difficult to read and so historically valuable. You can't generalize your way out of it. It's too specific. Fort Vaux was not Fort Douaumont. It was smaller, less architecturally imposing, lower in the order of French strategic priorities. But by late May of 1916, after 3 months of brutal fighting in the ridges northeast of Verdun, Vaux had become critically important as a defensive anchor on the right flank of the French position. When the Germans launched a major assault on the 1st of June, French forces had already been fighting in and around the fort's outer works for weeks. What began on the 1st of June was not an attack on a well-rested, fully stocked garrison. It was the final closure of a siege that had been developing for some time. The fighting inside the fort's corridors was something for which almost no military tradition had a frame of reference. The corridors were approximately 2 meters wide and 2 meters high, barely enough for 2 men to pass. German assault troops pushed into the interior with grenades, flamethrowers, and in some cases, simply their rifles, working through the tunnels in the dark. Raynal's defenders responded in kind. The specific horror of the Klein Flammenwerfer, the portable German flamethrower used in these engagements, in an enclosed corridor, was that it did not primarily kill by direct combustion. In a sealed stone passage, the burning jet consumed the oxygen in the air faster than fresh air could circulate. Men at the edge of its range didn't burn, they asphyxiated. Raynal's medical officer noted both categories of casualties in his report: burn victims and suffocation victims, from the same weapon in the same corridor engagements. The water ran out on the third day. Fort Vaux's cistern held approximately 35,000 litres under normal peacetime conditions, enough for an extended garrison. Under siege, with approximately 600 men sheltering inside, with the wounded requiring water for wound care, with no possibility of resupply, the cistern was exhausted within 72 hours of the siege beginning in earnest. Raynal's diary records the exact day on which he began rationing water to less than half a cup per man per day. He records the day he told his officers that the cistern was dry. He records, this is the passage I find most unbearable to read, the moment when the garrison began collecting water by pressing rags and cloths against the condensation on the fort's interior stone walls, wringing the fabric into containers, collecting the result. The stone weeps. The men drink the stone's tears. French official accounts state that 3 separate attempts were made to relieve Fort Vaux between the 2nd and 6th of June. German regimental records acknowledge only 2 significant French counterattacks in the Vaux sector during this period, and describe both as smaller in scale than French accounts suggest. Raynal's own memoir is quietly devastating on this point. He does not accuse anyone explicitly, but his writing about the relief attempts carries the weight of a man who believed, with specific reasons, which he declines to state, that those attempts were not made with adequate force. 3 accounts, 3 different pictures. The disagreement is still unresolved in the scholarship. By the 6th of June, the last day before surrender, Raynal's medical officer was reporting cases of men unable to speak because their throats had swollen from dehydration. The neurological effects of severe dehydration include confusion, inability to concentrate, muscular weakness, and eventually loss of consciousness, all of which were presenting in men who were simultaneously required to fight, to hold their positions, and to maintain the internal discipline of a besieged garrison. Raynal held them together. His diary, read day by day through the 6 days of the siege, describes a commanding officer exercising continuous moral authority over men who had every reason to collapse. He never ordered a defense to the last man. He didn't need to. The men stayed because he stayed. On the 7th of June, Raynal requested terms. The German response was to allow him to keep his sword, an acknowledgement ordered by Crown Prince Wilhelm himself, of the garrison's conduct during the siege. This is sometimes described as a gesture of chivalric soldiership, and perhaps it was. What Raynal wrote in his private diary that evening was rather less elevated. His first request as a prisoner of war was for water. His second was for food. His third was to know whether any of the relief attempts had been seriously made. The answers he received are not recorded. The pigeon was named Valiant, by the French government after the siege, and was awarded the Légion d'honneur by formal decree. It is one of the very few animals in French history to receive the nation's highest military honor. The pigeon is preserved, mounted, in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. A small brown bird in a glass case, positioned near displays of artillery and medals. The tag below the case explains its history. It is the only messenger who got out of Fort Vaux alive, and it was half-blinded and dying when it arrived. There is something in the Fort Vaux story that runs through the whole of Verdun like a structural element. The gap between information and response. Raynal had information. His messages got through, or most of them did. The information was received in the French rear. The response was inadequate or delayed, or both. This pattern repeats at every scale of the battle. Driant's warnings about undefended positions, received and ignored. The fort's garrison reduction, recorded and implemented without apparent consequence. The relief attempts, launched in insufficient strength against a fully alerted enemy. At Verdun, the French army had no shortage of information about what was happening. What it had a shortage of was the capacity to translate information into action at the speed and scale that the situation required. This is a systems problem, not a courage problem. It's worth being precise about which kind of failure actually happened. The fort was retaken by France on the 2nd of November, 1916, almost exactly 5 months after Raynal's surrender. When French troops entered the fort, they found the corridor walls near the last defensive positions still carrying the scratched names of men who had served there. The names weren't carved. There was no time and no tools for carving. They were scratched with whatever was available. Fingernails, knife tips, belt buckles. Several of them are still legible. The fort is open to visitors today. You can walk the corridors where the flamethrower engagements happened, where men pressed cloths against stone walls to collect water, where a garrison of 600 held for 6 days against everything that was put against them. The stone is still black in places, from fires that burned in June of 1916. Before the French troops entered, the German garrison had done something that was noticed and recorded in the French after-action reports. They had erected a sign in the corridor near the old French defensive position. In French, not German. It read, Aux défenseurs héroïques de Fort de Vaux. To the heroic defenders of Fort Vaux. The German soldiers who had captured the fort from Raynal's garrison and had then held it for 5 months under French bombardment left a memorial to the men they had defeated before they abandoned the position. The language of the memorial is the language of the people they'd beaten. That detail has always stayed with me. The specific grammar of respect that exists between professional soldiers who have done terrible things to each other, expressed in the language of the people they hurt. Chapter 7. The Chemist's War Comes to Verdun. Somewhere in the records of a German artillery battery operating in the Verdun sector in the spring of 1916, there is an after-action report describing a fire mission conducted on the 7th of May. The report, preserved in the archives of the German military, lists the target, the quantity of ammunition expended, the time of fire, the battery positions. It is written in exactly the same bureaucratic register as every other fire mission report. Same columns, same format, same clipped military prose. What the columns record is the firing of 13,800 shells into French positions near Chatancourt. The shells were filled with phosgene. The report notes no particular distinction between this mission and any other. Gas shells, to the artillerymen filling out the form, were a fire mission like any other fire mission. That gap between the bureaucratic normality of the report and the physical reality it describes, 13,800 containers of a substance that dissolves the lining of human lungs, fired into positions occupied by men, is the subject of this chapter. Because the gas war at Verdun was not a sideshow or a footnote, it was a systematic component of the battle's killing machinery. It used the most lethal chemical agent deployed in the entire First World War, and it has been almost entirely displaced in popular memory by the mustard gas attacks of 1917 and beyond. Phosgene, carbonyl chloride, chemical symbol COCl2, was responsible for an estimated 85% of all gas deaths in the First World War. not chlorine, not mustard gas, which wasn't introduced until 1917. Phosgene, colorless, heavier than air, and, this is the detail that made it strategically extraordinary, it smelled like freshly cut hay, like a summer meadow. Survivors at Verdun recorded the specific sensory experience of detecting phosgene. A pleasant, organic smell, the smell of something living, in a landscape where everything living had been destroyed. The men who learned to associate that pleasant smell with immediate danger were experiencing a specific kind of psychological damage that no amount of training fully prepares a person for. The conversion of beauty into mortal threat. The mechanism of phosgene as a killing agent is worth understanding precisely because the precision of it is so disturbing. Phosgene molecules react with the protein and lipid structures of the alveolar membrane, the thin tissue in the lungs across which oxygen passes into the blood. The reaction is initially asymptomatic. A man exposed to a sublethal concentration might feel mild throat irritation, or nothing at all. He might walk back from his post, report for duties at the rear, eat, sleep. In the 12 to 24 hours following exposure, the damaged membrane begins to leak. Fluid accumulates in the alveolar spaces. The lungs fill, slowly, with a substance that is, essentially, the dissolved and liquefied remains of the tissue that was supposed to keep air and blood separated. Death, when it came by drowning, from the inside. And the most terrifying operational feature of this mechanism, from the German planner's perspective, and it was a feature, not a side effect, was that the 24-hour delay between exposure and collapse meant that men could be fatally poisoned at the front line and walk back to medical facilities before dying, distributing the casualty burden across the entire rear area and making immediate assessment of the attack's scale impossible for French commanders. The German tactical innovation with gas at Verdun was not simply the use of phosgene. It was the sequential combination of gas types. German artillery doctrine, refined through 1915 and applied systematically at Verdun in 1916, used what are now called mixed agent attacks. A first bombardment would deliver Weisskreuz, white cross shells, filled with a lacrimatory and sneezing agent that caused intense eye irritation and uncontrollable sneezing. The effect was to force men to remove their gas masks or pull them away from their faces. Then, after a short interval, the second bombardment came. Grünkreuz, green cross shells, filled with phosgene or diphosgene. Men who had removed their masks in response to the first agent received the second agent directly into their airways. The sequence was designed specifically around the limitations of the available protective equipment, which means that German chemical warfare planners in 1916 had studied the French M2 respirator, understood its operational weaknesses, and built an attack sequence to exploit them. The French M2 mask, which formed the primary respiratory protection of French infantry at Verdun, was a fabric hood treated with chemical absorbents. It provided reasonable protection against chlorine at the concentrations likely to be encountered in the field, and had been reasonably effective during the chlorine attacks of 1915. The problem was phosgene. The M2's absorbent chemicals were not optimized for phosgene, and at high concentrations, the kind of concentrations produced by 13,800 shells concentrated into a defined target area, the mask's protection was inadequate and degraded rapidly with extended exposure. A French War Ministry evaluation report from early 1916 had flagged the mask's uncertain performance against phosgene. The evaluation noted that testing against this specific agent was incomplete. The troops at Verdun were issued the M2 anyway, because there was nothing better available in sufficient quantities. I find this particular bureaucratic moment, a ministry evaluation flagging a known gap, followed by the distribution of inadequate equipment because nothing better existed, to be one of the most representative documents of the war. Not the atrocity of gas itself, which is well understood, but the specific institutional texture of knowing that your protective equipment doesn't work against a weapon the enemy is using, and issuing it anyway because the alternative is issuing nothing. That decision was made in offices, in writing, by named officials who signed the relevant forms. The French retaliated in kind. In July of 1916, French artillery deployed its own phosgene chlorine mixture, vincenite, against German positions in the Verdun sector. An internal memorandum from the French Service des Poudres from around the same period noted that French gas mask production in the summer of 1916 was still insufficient to fully re-equip all frontline divisions simultaneously. France was firing a chemical agent against which its own troops were inadequately protected, in response to being attacked with a chemical agent against which its own troops were inadequately protected. The escalatory cycle had closed completely on itself. Neither side could afford to stop, because stopping unilaterally in a chemical exchange while the other side retained its gas capacity would be a dangerous concession of initiative. Both sides continued, because the logic of escalation is self-sustaining once the threshold has been crossed. On the 19th of May, 12 days after the first large Chattancourt attack, German batteries fired another 13,000 shells into the same sector. The concentration these repeated attacks built up in the soil and the low-lying ground around Chattancourt created persistent contamination that outlasted the individual attacks by weeks. Survivors described specific zones where the smell of hay returned in damp weather, long after the last shells had landed, the residual phosgene slowly off-gassing from saturated soil. The landscape itself had become a delivery mechanism. This process of chemical contamination persisting in soil and continuing to release active agent in changing atmospheric conditions is the same basic chemistry that makes parts of the Zone Rouge dangerous to this day. The difference is that in 1916, the men living in those positions didn't have soil sampling equipment or atmospheric dispersal models. They had the smell of hay and the knowledge of what it meant. The gas war at Verdun was never resolved. Neither side developed adequate protection against the agents being used in the time frame of the battle. Neither side stopped using gas because of the other side's casualties. Both sides continued to develop more effective agents and more efficient delivery mechanisms, while their own soldiers died in ways that the men giving the orders had specifically chosen. The escalatory logic ran to the end of the war, uninterrupted. And the specific chemical agents deployed in the Verdun sector in 1916, particularly the arsenic-based compounds like diphenylamine chloroarsine, known as Blue Cross or Blaukreuz, introduced in the summer of that year, are still in the soil. The chemistry didn't stop in December of 1916. It's still running. Chapter 8. The Treadmill General. Philippe Pétain was 59 years old when he took command of the Verdun sector on the 25th of February 1916. He had spent most of his military career being quietly passed over for promotion by an establishment that found his ideas inconvenient. He believed that firepower, not élan, killed soldiers. He believed that infantry could only succeed where artillery had first suppressed the defense. He believed that unnecessary casualties were not a sign of determination, but of incompetence. These views had made him deeply unpopular at French General Headquarters for most of the preceding decade. They also happened to be correct, and 1916 proved them correct in the most expensive possible way. There is a tension at the center of any serious examination of Pétain that I want to be direct about before we go any further. This is a man who saved Verdun, who preserved the French army when it was close to breaking, who was, genuinely, the most capable defensive commander France produced in the First World War. He is also the man who, in June of 1940, accepted the armistice with Nazi Germany, who headed the Vichy regime, and who was tried for treason after the liberation, with a verdict that would have sent him to his death if his age hadn't intervened. You can't write about Pétain at Verdun without knowing what came after. You also can't explain 1940 without understanding 1916. The same man did both things. The same qualities drove both decisions. This chapter is about that consistency, not about either verdict. When Pétain arrived at Souilly in February 1916 to take command, his first act was, as we've discussed, a logistics inspection. His second was the issuance of a series of operational directives establishing a fundamental principle. French infantry would advance only where French artillery could systematically support them. Not where artillery had supported them, where it could support them. Future tense, prospective. Infantry operations were to be planned backwards from the available artillery coverage, not the other way around. This was the inversion of the entire dominant tradition of French offensive doctrine, which had built the attaque à outrance philosophy, attack to the utmost, on the premise that the moral force of the advancing infantry could overcome fire through the sheer will to advance. Petain's directive said, in effect, that the moral force of advancing infantry was worth nothing to dead men. French infantry should advance where the guns had made the advance survivable. Nowhere else. His private correspondence from this period is illuminating in ways that official communications never quite are. Pétain maintained a long correspondence with a woman he referred to as Nini. His letters to her were not published during his lifetime, and only emerged in scholarly use decades after the war. What's striking about these letters is their frankness about institutional politics. When Joffre, who remained commander-in-chief of all French forces while Pétain commanded the Verdun sector, pressed for offensive operations to recover lost ground, Pétain's official replies were measured and formally correct. His private letters described the instruction in rather different terms. He wrote to Nini with the frankness of a man who has spent his career working within an institution he privately regards as partially insane, and has learned to manage that condition through a very precise separation of public and private voice. The Noria, the rotation system that Pétain built to cycle French divisions through Verdun at a pace rapid enough to prevent the cumulative exhaustion that had been destroying units, was a response to a specific observation. Men who stayed in the Verdun sector for extended periods broke down at a rate that was higher than the casualty figures suggested. They didn't just suffer physical wounds, they suffered the specific psychological disintegration that came from living in a landscape where death was not an occasional risk, but a continuous ambient condition. A place where the sound of artillery never stopped, where the sight of the dead was as routine as the sight of the living, where the boundary between the two was literally unstable, because the dead kept surfacing through the soil after each rainstorm. The Noria didn't save men from Verdun. It limited the duration of exposure. It was the difference between a toxin that kills at a sustained dose and the same toxin at a lower dose for a shorter period. It didn't cure anyone. It just prevented the fatal accumulation. By rotating approximately 42 divisions through the sector during his 5 months of direct command, Pétain put roughly 44% of the entire French army's divisional strength through Verdun at some point. This has a number attached to it that the bare organizational description doesn't fully communicate. What it means is that by the end of 1916, there was almost no formation in the French army that had not been to Verdun. There was almost no French infantryman who didn't know what Verdun meant. The experience was broadly distributed across the national army in a way that nothing comparable was on the German side. When the French mutinies came in the spring of 1917, triggered by the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive, they came from an army that had already been to Verdun and back, that had survived the worst the Germans could do, and that was now refusing not to fight, but to die pointlessly. This distinction matters. Pétain was promoted to command of the Central Army Group in May of 1916, moved upstairs, effectively removed from direct command of the Verdun battle itself, replaced by General Nivelle. The official history presents this as a natural operational evolution. Petain's private letters present it as what it was: a sideways removal by an establishment that had found him insufficiently offensive. Nivelle was everything Petain wasn't: charismatic, politically connected, enthusiastically aggressive, and willing to promise the offensive breakthroughs that French politicians desperately wanted to hear were possible. Petain wrote privately about his replacement in terms that cannot be reproduced here, but that amount to a precise prediction of the disaster that duly arrived in April 1917 on the Chemin des Dames, when Nivelle's promised breakthrough produced mass French casualties and the most serious mutiny crisis the French army faced in the entire war. The phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, is universally attributed to Petain. It appears in documentaries, on memorial plaques, in school curricula on both sides of the Channel, as the defining expression of French resolve at Verdun. The earliest documented use of the phrase in any primary source is in a communiqué issued by General Robert Nivelle in June of 1916, after the Germans captured Fleury. Nivelle used it, specifically, as the closing line of an order of the day. It was then attributed to Petain, probably because Petain was more beloved, and because Nivelle's subsequent disgrace made him an awkward founding father for the national legend. The defining slogan of French resistance at Verdun was coined by a man whose next major military operation killed tens of thousands of French soldiers pointlessly. Nobody changed the plaques. The arc of Petain's life, from Verdun to Vichy, is not as discontinuous as the two verdicts on him suggest. The Petain who saved Verdun through patience, logistics, defensive tenacity, and an absolute refusal to waste lives on impossible objectives is recognizably related to the Petain who decided in June 1940 that France could not be defended conventionally and that accommodation was preferable to total destruction. In both cases, he was making a calculation about what the ground could bear. In 1916, the calculation was correct. In 1940, it was, in ways that were not entirely foreseeable from where he stood, catastrophically wrong. The difficulty is that the same reasoning process produced both conclusions, and history doesn't always tell you in advance which version of a calculation you're running. Chapter 9. Fleury, the village that died 16 times. In the French administrative registry, in the prefecture of the Meuse department, there exists today a file for the commune of Fleury-devant-Douaumont. The file contains a budget. It contains a record of the current appointed mayor. It contains property boundaries, legal designations, administrative category. Everything a functioning commune needs to exist on paper. What it doesn't contain, what cannot be added to it by law, is a population. Fleury-devant-Douaumont has had 0 permanent residents since 1916. It has had a mayor continuously since 1919. The two facts coexist without resolution, which is itself a kind of administrative summary of what happened to this village in 1916. Before the war, Fleury was an ordinary settlement on the ridge northeast of Verdun. 422 inhabitants, 70 buildings, a church, a school, a post office, farmhouses around the usual central square. The cadastral records from before the war still exist. You can look at the entries, individual properties, their owners, their assessed values. The kind of administrative record that accumulates quietly in a place where nothing dramatic has happened for a long time. The kind of record that makes a place real in a legal and human sense. In the spring of 1916, the German advance brought the front line through and beyond Fleury, and from June of that year, the village was in the fighting zone. The civilian population had already been evacuated. What remained was the structural shell of a place. Buildings, streets, the stone walls of the church, and then, progressively, not even that. Fleury changed hands 16 times. This figure comes from French and German records that, for once, are in broad agreement. though French sources sometimes give a figure of 16 and occasionally slightly higher, while German records from the specific regimental histories typically record 16 changes of control between the 23rd of June and the 18th of August 1916. The small discrepancy, where it exists, arises from the problem of defining what control meant in a place that had ceased to exist as a place. By July of 1916, Fleury wasn't a village anymore. It was a set of map references in the fighting zone. Whether a German unit controlled Fleury depended on which map reference you were using, and whether the French still occupied the cellar of the building, whose upper structure had been in German hands since the previous afternoon. On the 23rd of June, German forces reached and captured Fleury as part of the most dangerous phase of their advance, the period when German troops came closest to Verdun itself, pushing to within approximately 5 kilometers of the city. The position gave observation over French supply routes and was tactically valuable enough to justify the efforts both sides made to control it. The Germans threw several thousand shells at Fleury on the day of capture. By that point, the shelling was not directed at buildings because there were no buildings left to shell in the functional sense. It was directed at map squares that happened to contain the ruins of a former village and, more relevantly, the soldiers of both armies sheltering in those ruins. What the 16 changes of hand produced, cumulatively, over approximately 8 weeks of fighting, was the progressive conversion of Fleury from a ruined village into something that soil scientists would later describe as mega-disturbed terrain. The overlapping shell holes, post-war surveys estimated an average of 1 shell impact per square meter across the entire former village area, destroyed the stratigraphic layers of the soil to a depth of several meters. Not just the buildings, the roads, the cellars, the drainage systems, the wells. The accumulated physical infrastructure of generations of habitation was not simply destroyed, but physically mixed into the soil matrix with military waste, chemical residue, and human remains. And then the entire mixture was detonated repeatedly, mixed again, and covered with craters. What the armies were fighting over by late July wasn't Fleury. It was the concept of Fleury, the geographical idea of a ridge feature with particular tactical significance. The actual village had ceased to exist, and neither side had time to notice. The 18th of August 1916, French colonial troops recaptured Fleury for the last time. A French communiqué announced the recapture of a village. There was no village. The announcement used the village's name because the village's name corresponded to a map reference that French forces now controlled. The language of the communiqué and the physical reality it described were operating in almost entirely separate registers. After the war, the French post-war land survey, the Région Libérée assessment, classified land in the former battle zone on a 5-point scale from habitable and cultivable to permanently uninhabitable. Fleury received the terminal classification. The specific criteria cited in the assessment were unexploded ordnance density estimated at 1 dud per 5 square meters, soil arsenic contamination measured at levels far exceeding any safe threshold for agricultural use, and the presence of human remains distributed throughout the soil matrix at multiple depths. All 3 criteria remain true in 2026. The classification hasn't changed because the conditions haven't changed. I looked up the current mayor of Fleury-de-Vendôme before writing this chapter. The commune has a mayor. The mayor attends regional administrative meetings, submits a budget, maintains the commune's formal existence in the French administrative system. The annual budget is a few thousand euros, enough to maintain the markers and access routes at the site, to represent the commune at official commemorations, to preserve the legal fiction that is also the legal truth of the place. The mayor of a village where no one has lived for over a century. France has decided, formally and in law, that Fleury must continue to exist as a legal entity in perpetuity, that the absence must be officially maintained, that the disappearance must be administered. There's something in that decision that I've thought about for a long time and still can't entirely resolve. It's either a form of respect so profound it has become institutional, or a form of administrative grief so deep it has become indistinguishable from bureaucracy. Maybe both. Under French law, the 9 villages that were destroyed beyond recovery, the villages morts pour la France, the villages that died for France, cannot be repopulated without an act of the National Assembly. The legislation was passed in 1919 and has never been repealed. France has placed itself under a legal obligation to maintain these absences for as long as the French Republic exists. The Zone Rouge is not only chemistry, it is statute law. The poison ground is protected by the same kind of legal instrument that protects national monuments, historic buildings, the cathedrals. France looked at what the war had left it and decided that the correct response was not to rebuild, but to preserve the destruction as a form of evidence. The ruins of Fleury, which are not even ruins, because ruins imply identifiable remains of structures, and there are no identifiable remains of structures, are the most honest monument the war produced, precisely because they weren't designed to be a monument at all. Chapter 10. The German side of the ledger. The Kriegsbriefe gefallener Studenten, the war letters of fallen students, was compiled from correspondence sent by German university-educated soldiers during the war and published in Germany in the 1920s. The collection runs to hundreds of letters, written by men of varying backgrounds and temperaments, covering every major German theatre of operations from 1914 to 1918. What strikes any reader who comes to it after extensive reading in the French equivalent literature, the published collections of poilu letters and diaries that have appeared steadily since the 1990s, is how closely the German letters track the French ones. Same artillery, same physical descriptions of the landscape, same fragmentation of time under bombardment, same mordant humor, same rage at the gap between the language that official communications used and the reality those communications were describing. Same exhaustion. The letters of the fallen students are not a separate war from the one Etienne Tonty described in his diary. They are the same war, looked at from the other direction. This is the chapter that probably should have come earlier, and deliberately didn't. It is easier, particularly in a narrative built around French primary sources, to spend 10 chapters discussing what the battle did to France, before stopping to ask what it did to Germany. But if Verdun is to be understood, rather than simply commemorated, the German experience of the battle has to be examined with the same rigor. And the German experience contains several facts that don't appear comfortably in the standard account. The German assault on the 21st of February was planned, as we've discussed, as an operation to reach the Verdun fortresses within approximately 48 hours of the opening bombardment. It didn't. The resistance at the Bois de Cour, the general resilience of the French defensive system despite its neglect, and the specific geometry of the terrain combined to slow the advance far short of what the operational plan required. By early March, German forces on the right bank of the Meuse were advancing through terrain that had been churned by their own preparatory bombardment into a landscape almost as difficult to move through as the trenches they'd destroyed. And from positions on the left bank of the river, which the initial German attack plan had not targeted, French artillery was firing directly into the flank of the German assault corridor. This is the geometry problem. The Meuse runs roughly north-south at Verdun. The main German assault was planned along the right bank, east of the river. But the left bank rises in a series of ridges, including the hill system called the Mort Homme and the adjacent hill 304, which dominated the entire right bank corridor from the west. French artillerists on those ridges could fire at roughly 90 degrees to the German axis of advance, directly into the flank of the attacking waves. German defences on the right bank were oriented to face French fire from the north and northeast. The crossfire from the west hit them from a direction their positions offered no cover against. The Crown Prince's headquarters identified this problem within the first weeks of the battle and requested permission to extend the attack to the left bank. Falkenhayn refused, apparently on grounds of overextension. The refusal meant that German assault divisions continued to absorb enfilading fire from a direction they couldn't neutralize for weeks, with predictable consequences for their casualty rates. When permission was finally granted to attack the left bank, specifically the Mort-Homme complex, in early March, a new and equally grinding subsidiary battle opened. The German assault on the Mort-Homme was not part of the original operational plan. It was a remedial operation, an attempt to fix a tactical problem that should have been identified and addressed in the planning phase, but wasn't. Men died on the slopes of the Mort-Homme in the spring of 1916 because a geometric relationship between two ridge systems on opposite banks of a river had not been adequately wargamed before the assault was launched. This is not a minor oversight. It is a fundamental failure of planning, and its consequences were measured in German casualties that accumulated over months before the left bank problem was even partially resolved. The German casualty figures from Verdun are, as I flagged in the context of the statistics chapter, genuinely contested. The Reichsarchiv history gives German losses as approximately 337,000. Hermann Wendt's 1931 analysis, working from regimental records rather than army-level summaries, arrived at a figure approximately 90,000 higher. If Wendt's figures are correct, and his methodology, while not unassailable, is more transparent than the Reichsarchive compilation process, German casualties at Verdun may have exceeded French casualties, which means the strategic logic of the Christmas memorandum, to whatever extent that document represented actual German strategic intent, produced the opposite of its stated outcome. Germany lost more men than France. In the battle designed to bleed France dry, it bled itself. Fort Douaumont, the fortress whose capture in February 1916 had been celebrated with church bells across Germany and had generated genuine national jubilation, became something rather different in the months that followed. German troops garrisoning the fort through the spring and summer were subject to continuous French artillery bombardment. The same fort that had been considered nearly impregnable by French defenders was equally uncomfortable for its German occupants, for the same reason. It was a large, fixed, known target, and artillery that couldn't destroy it could certainly make it miserable to inhabit. German soldiers in the fort's interior referred to it, privately, in letters that survived because the men who wrote them did not, with a sardonic nickname that translates roughly as the Bleachery, a reference to the way the constant bombardment and poor air quality bleached the colour from everything inside. The symbol of German triumph at Verdun had become, by summer of 1916, a place that its own garrison dreaded. Then, on the 8th of May, an accidental detonation of stored German artillery propellant charges in the fort's interior killed somewhere between 650 and 800 German soldiers in a single event. Estimates vary, and the exact figure remains uncertain because many of the dead were never recoverable. Most of the bodies were sealed inside the fort. They are still there. When France retook Douaumont in October, the sealed chamber became the tomb it has remained ever since. Falkenhayn was dismissed on the 29th of August 1916, with the German position at Verdun deteriorating and the Somme offensive adding catastrophic losses on a second major front simultaneously. Hindenburg and Ludendorff replaced him. Their first assessment of the Verdun situation was that the battle should have been terminated months earlier, and they began planning withdrawal from the most exposed positions. The battle continued for another 4 months after Falkenhayn's removal, not because either side's new commanders wanted it to continue, but because stopping required acknowledging, publicly, that the operation had failed. The political cost of that acknowledgement, on both sides, was estimated higher than the military cost of continuing. So it continued. The logic isn't complicated, it's just very ugly. Chapter 11. the Morthom, the hill that ate everything. The name predates the war. Le Morthom, Dead Man's Hill, appears on French survey maps from the 18th century. The name derived, most likely, from some local legend about a man killed on the ridge in circumstances that have been entirely forgotten. It meant nothing specific to anyone on the 21st of February 1916. By March, it was one of the most contested pieces of ground on the Western Front. By the time summer came, the men assigned to attack or defend it had developed their own dark relationship with the name. You went to the Morthom. You took your chances with what you found there. The tactical significance of the ridge has been described in the previous chapter in terms of the enfilading fire problem it created for the German advance on the right bank of the Meuse. It's worth dwelling on the geography more precisely, because the shape of the ground here determined the shape of the battle in ways that are easy to state, but surprisingly hard to visualize. The Morthom rises to approximately 300 meters above the valley floor on the west side of the Meuse. From its summit, or from French artillery positions dug into the reverse slopes below the summit, where they couldn't be directly observed by German forward observers, a French artillery officer could look across the river and see, at ranges varying from roughly 4 to 11 kilometers, the entire axis of the German advance on the right bank. The Meuse Valley at this point is not wide. From the Morthom, the right bank was not a distant glimpse. It was a view. French batteries on the west bank were firing into the side of the German attack corridor in the way that a person standing on a pavement fires into the side of a vehicle passing on the road. Oblique, cross-ranging, hitting the parts that face the shooter, rather than the parts designed to resist frontal impact. German earthworks on the right bank were built facing north, facing northeast, facing the direction of the expected French counterfire. They were effectively useless against fire coming from 90 degrees to their left. The German assault on the Morthom began on the 6th of March, 1916, 2 weeks after the main attack opened. The delay itself tells you something. This was a remedial operation, launched when the tactical problem had become impossible to ignore, against a feature that the original operational plan hadn't included. The French had been preparing defensive positions on the Morthom since at least the autumn of 1915. The ridges were wired, fortified, and organized in depth in ways that the right bank French positions, neglected by the same institutional failures we've already discussed, were not. The German 10th Reserve Corps, assigned to the left bank assault, found a defensive system far better prepared than what had been encountered on the right bank at the start of the battle. What followed between March and May of 1916 on the Morthom was a miniature version of the entire Verdun battle compressed into one ridge system: attack, counterattack, partial capture, reinforcement, loss, recapture, stalemate. German troops reached the crest of the Morthom on approximately the 20th of April. The date is given differently in different sources, which is itself telling, but discovered that holding the crest didn't solve the artillery problem, because French batteries had repositioned onto a secondary ridge to the south that provided almost equivalent observation over the right bank corridor. The tactical problem had migrated. You couldn't capture your way out of it. The geometry of the terrain was deeper than any position within it. The French artillery records from the Morthom sector give the clearest quantitative picture of what sustained positional defense cost in material terms. In the period from March through June of 1916, French batteries in the Morthom sector expended approximately 1.2 million 75mm shells in this one sector. That's roughly 10,000 rounds per day across the primary defending batteries. The 75mm round weighed 7.24 kilograms. The total weight of this ammunition alone, in one sector over 4 months, was approximately 8,600 tons, for a ridge 3 kilometers long. This was not extraordinary by Verdun standards. This was the normal rate of consumption for a sector under sustained pressure. Multiply it across the entire 40-kilometer front, and the figure for the whole battle becomes less surprising and no less staggering. The French 75mm field gun, the Canon de 75 Model 1897, was one of the genuinely revolutionary pieces of military technology that shaped the First World War's opening phase, and it remained the backbone of French defensive firepower throughout Verdun. Its hydropneumatic recoil system absorbed the firing shock within the gun's own mechanism, allowing the barrel to return to its original position after each shot, without the crew having to re-aim. This made possible a rate of fire that older artillery designs couldn't match, up to 15 rounds per minute in urgent situations, 6 to 8 rounds per minute in sustained operation. The 75's limitations were the limitations of its flat trajectory. It fired at a relatively low angle, which made it excellent for direct fire against infantry in the open, and for long-range interdiction fire on roads and supply routes, but less effective against troops dug deep into trenches or sheltering on reverse slopes. The Germans adapted to this within weeks, using the reverse slope of the Mort Homme and adjacent ridges to shelter from the 75's plunging fire limitations, while remaining exposed to observation from the same slopes that the French howitzers, firing at higher angles, were supposed to be neutralizing. The observation logbooks from French artillery units on the Mort Homme are among the most clinically instructive documents produced by the battle. They record, in timed sequences, the location of targets, the battery ordered to engage, the result of the fire mission, and the next target. They run continuously. A fire mission is completed, the result is assessed in a line or two, the next mission begins. Occasionally, in the middle of a sequence of tactical fire direction, there is a line that simply describes what is visible from the observation post. Numerous dead on slope, not collected. 4 words, inserted between 2 fire missions, in the same handwriting, at the same level of emotional register as the trajectory data on either side of it. This is what artillery observation logs look like. This is how the killing was administered. By June of 1916, the opposing lines on the Mort Homme complex had stabilized, approximately 600 meters apart in the most contested sector. Close enough that individual soldiers on both sides could sometimes hear movement in the other's positions. Far enough that effective grenade range couldn't bridge the gap. Near enough that movement in daylight was routinely fatal. Far enough that any attack required preparation, artillery support, and the acceptance of casualties that could not, in any arithmetic of ground gained, be described as proportionate. The strategic value of the Mort Homme as a problem to be solved was by this point approximately equal to the strategic value of the Mort Homme as a position to be held. Both were negative. Both sides had paid more to contest this ridge than the ridge was worth, and both sides were committed to continuing the contest because stopping unilaterally would be both militarily dangerous and politically impossible. Dead Man's Hill had been well named, long before anyone died there in 1916. It just hadn't been accurate yet. Chapter 12. The Diary of Etienne Tanti. One voice for 300,000. Les Violettes des Tranchées, The Violets of the Trenches, is not a famous book. It was published in a small French edition in 2002 by a family press, compiled from the letters and diary entries that Etienne Tanti sent home during the First World War. Tanti was a soldier who wrote well, thought carefully, and had the unusual quality of being able to observe his own experience with a degree of detachment, even while it was happening to him. His book has never been translated into English. It hasn't had the popular reception of some other poilu accounts. But for a researcher working on Verdun, it is one of the most important primary sources available, precisely because Tanti is not trying to be important. He is trying to tell the truth, as he experienced it, in real time, to the people he loved. The family archive preserves the letters in their original envelopes. Tanti pressed things into the pages of his diary as he wrote, the common practice of men who wanted to send something real home with the words. Flowers mostly, a dried leaf. The item that gives the book its title is a pressed violet, now more than 100 years old, still faintly purple, still visible in the original diary. Tanti found it growing through the mud between two dead men in a shell crater. He picked it. He pressed it into the page. He wrote one sentence about it, a sentence the family has asked not to be reproduced commercially, and which I will only describe. It was a sentence that accepted the existence of a flower in a place where flowers had no business being, and found in that acceptance something that was neither comfort nor despair, but something quieter and harder than either. Before Verdun, Tanti's letters home were those of a man who wrote with pleasure, who made jokes, who reported on the state of his equipment and the quality of the food with the cheerful precision of a man who liked details. He was curious. He paid attention. He described his fellow soldiers with the affection of someone who genuinely liked most people and found the others interesting. His letters from the period before 1916 are, despite the circumstances, occasionally funny. They are the letters of a specific person with a specific sensibility, living through extraordinary circumstances without losing himself in them. Then he arrived at Verdun, and the letters changed. Not immediately, and not uniformly. There were passages in the Verdun letters that retained the earlier voice. But something shifted in the texture of the writing, and Tanti himself was aware of it. In one letter, the precise dating places it in the summer of 1916. He wrote about the difficulty of describing what he was experiencing to people who hadn't experienced it, not because the experience was too terrible to describe, but because the available language kept arriving wrong. The words that existed in French for what was happening at Verdun were the words of exaggeration and hyperbole, words suited to extremity, and Tanti found himself unable to use them because they felt like lies in a different direction. The truth of Verdun wasn't dramatic. It was relentless. It was a grinding, daily accumulation of sensory and psychological pressure that didn't arrive in dramatic scenes, but in the sustained texture of a place that had been entirely given over to killing, in which the ordinary rhythms of human life, eating, sleeping, talking, resting, continued, grotesquely, within that texture. His description of approaching Verdun for the first time on the Voie Sacrée, written in the form of a letter home, contains the image that has stayed with me the longest. He described the faces of the men coming back down the road, coming out of the battle zone, heading toward the rear, as looking, he wrote, like stones that had been in the river too long. I've read 40 or 50 individual accounts of approaching Verdun, from soldiers of different ranks, different regiments, different periods in the battle. Tanti's image is the one I remember, not because it's the most literary, because it's the most accurate. Stone, smoothed by water into an absence of angles. Expression worn away. Something essential removed by sustained exposure. The specific sensory details in Tanti's writing are the most valuable element of the diary from a historical standpoint, because they record things that official records don't track, and that more self-conscious writers tended to filter. His observation about the smell of different shell types is one of the most specific olfactory accounts of the artillery war available in any language. The propellant charges of the French 75mm rounds, he noted, smelled on detonation like hot iron, with something sweet underneath. He compared it to a blacksmith shop near a bakery. German heavy caliber shells produced a heavier, darker smell, something organic and wrong, the smell of earth that had been forced to become something it wasn't supposed to be. And then there was the smell of phosgene, fresh hay, summer, green and living. Tanti wrote that after Verdun, for years after, the smell of cut grass in summer made him feel sick. The pastoral had been converted, in his nervous system, to a death signal. He smelled a meadow, and his body responded as though he were about to die. His regiment, the 106th Infantry, rotated through the Verdun sector 3 times during the battle, consistent with Pétain's Noria system. On its 3 tours, the regiment suffered combined casualties of approximately 2,400 men from an establishment strength of roughly 3,200. This is a 75% casualty rate across the year, not in a single action, but accumulated across 3 periods of intense fighting, with replacements filling the gaps between tours. The regiment that came back from Verdun in December 1916 shared its regimental number with the one that had gone in February. It shared very little else. There is a specific entry in Tanti's diary from one of the later Verdun periods. The precise date is not given in the published version, describing a position his regiment was ordered to take. He records taking the position, or at least reaching what he understood to be the position. The regimental war diary, for what appears to be the same period, records the regiment as having failed to take the position and having suffered significant casualties in the attempt. Both documents are specific. Both documents are credible. They describe different events at the same time in the same place, which means that either Tanti was in a different part of the action from the one the official record was describing, or the official record was recording a different, perhaps optimistic, version of events from what the men on the ground experienced, or both. This is the kind of source conflict that only becomes visible when you read personal and official records simultaneously. And it matters because it's a reminder that the official record of any battle is a composite construction built upward from the ground level and losing accuracy at every step. Tanti survived the war. He lived until 1972. He died at 82 years of age, which means he lived 56 years after Verdun. His family reports that he spoke very little about the war in the decades after it ended. The letters and diary entries that formed the published book were found after his death, preserved carefully, never publicly shared during his lifetime. The violets are still in the pages. They are still faintly purple. 100 years of preservation in a box somewhere in France, and they haven't entirely lost their color. I find I can't decide whether that's a detail that means something or a detail that simply is. Both, probably. Most things at Verdun turn out to be both. Chapter 13. The Bone Harvest. What October Gave Back. On the morning of the 25th of October, 1916, a French military medical officer entered Fort Douaumont with the advance elements of the units that had retaken it the previous day. His report, filed that afternoon, preserved in the records at Vincennes, begins with a numbered list. Item 1. The number of French dead found on the fort's exterior slopes. Item 2. The number of German dead found inside the fort's corridors and chambers. Item 3. The number of body parts unattributable to individual remains. Item 4. Quantities of abandoned equipment, listed by category. The list is formatted identically to the supply inventories and material reports that fill the rest of the same archival box. The dead are in the same column format as the artillery shells. This is not callousness. It is the administrative grammar of industrial warfare, the only grammar that existed for this volume and this type of information. The recapture of Fort Douaumont on the 24th of October was, in strict military terms, a success. It was the largest and most carefully prepared French offensive action of the entire battle. 6 divisions, a 4-day preparatory bombardment of 855,264 shells, including heavy railway artillery that hadn't been available when the fort fell in February. That figure, 855,000 shells in 4 days, is worth holding against the original German opening bombardment of approximately 1 million shells across the entire front in 9 hours. The French preliminary bombardment for recapturing one fort was nearly as large as the German bombardment that started the entire battle. This is one of those statistical comparisons that says something important about how the war had changed in 8 months. The scale of what was considered necessary had inflated to match the scale of what was being attempted. And nobody seems to have noticed, or at least nobody with the authority to stop it. The tactical contrast between the fort's capture in February and its recapture in October is worth pausing on. In February, Sergeant Kunz of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment had walked in through an unguarded drainage channel with a rifle. No battle, no preparation, 2 hours. In October, France required a 4-day bombardment of nearly 1 million shells, 6 assault divisions, and a precisely coordinated attack to take back what a single sergeant had found lying open. The difference wasn't in the tactical quality of the respective forces. It was in what the fort represented, and what each side was willing to spend to hold or recapture it. The symbol had inflated far beyond its strategic value, and both armies paid accordingly. What the medical officer found inside on the 25th was the accumulated evidence of 8 months of the fort being contested, occupied, bombarded, and partially collapsed. In May of 1916, an accidental detonation of German artillery propellant, stored in the fort's lower levels, had produced an explosion that killed somewhere between 650 and 800 German soldiers. The estimate range reflects the fact that many of the bodies were never recovered, and that the explosion destroyed the records of who had been inside at the time. The survivors had sealed the damaged section of the fort with a makeshift wall, and continued to use the remaining sections. When French troops entered in October, the sealed section was still sealed. It remains sealed today. The fort is open to visitors. There is a corridor you can walk down, and at the end of it there is a wall. And behind the wall are the remains of the men who died in May of 1916. And the wall is not going to be opened, because opening it would serve no purpose, and would be, in the specific physical sense of that word, very difficult. The French counter-offensive that recaptured Douaumont was not a single action. It was the culminating phase of a shift in French military capability that had been building since the spring. Pétain's artillery doctrine, generalized across the entire French army through the summer, had changed the way the French fought. The October assault used what is now recognized as one of the first large-scale successful applications of coordinated combined arms operation on the Western Front. Artillery, infantry, and engineer units working to a single fire plan, each arm performing a specific function in a timed sequence. The artillery not simply destroying the defense, but suppressing it precisely long enough for infantry to cross the open ground before the suppression lifted. The word that would later be used for this approach, for the method that came to define successful Western Front offensive operations in 1917 and 18, was bite and hold. Douaumont in October was a bite and hold operation, very nearly perfectly executed. The French army that attacked in October 1916 was a qualitatively different institution from the one that had lost the fort in February, and the difference had been paid for in 9 months of catastrophic operational learning. Fort Vaux fell back into French hands on the 2nd of November 1916. The retaking of Vaux was easier than Douaumont. The German garrison, unable to hold the position under sustained French bombardment, and aware that the broader German position was deteriorating, chose not to fight to the last. When French troops entered, they found the corridors cleared, the equipment removed, and, as recorded in the French after-action report for the operation, a sign erected by the departing German garrison near the old French defensive position. In French, Aux défenseurs héroïques de Fort de Vaux, to the heroic defenders of Fort Vaux. The Germans had left a memorial to their enemies in the language of their enemies. I've mentioned this before, and I mention it again because it's the kind of detail that the narrative logic of the series, French defenders, German attackers, contested ground, tends to flatten, and the memorial sign refuses to be flattened. It was a real thing that real soldiers did. Make of it what you will. The final French offensive operations of the battle came in December, a sequence of attacks between the 15th and 18th of December that pushed the German line north by several kilometers and essentially restored the approximate position of the original French front from before the battle opened in February. 10 months. Roughly 700,000 casualties on both sides combined. The line, adjusted for the specific contours of 10 months of fighting, was approximately where it had started. This is the arithmetic of Verdun in its starkest form, and it is important to resist the temptation to dress it up or find the compensation in it. Both sides ended the battle claiming a form of victory. The French, because they had not been broken. The Germans, because they had inflicted enormous French casualties. Both claims had some basis. Neither claim justifies what the figure of 700,000 represents. But this series is not a court, and the point of examining both claims is not to issue a verdict. It is to establish that the logic that sustained this battle for 9 months after its strategic rationale had collapsed was not military logic. It was something else. Something more durable and more dangerous than military logic. We will come to what that something was. Chapter 14. Architects of Myth. How Verdun became a religion. Somewhere in the French military archives at Vincennes, among the administrative records of the wartime press and information services, there are documents that nobody particularly wants to quote in polished histories of the battle. They are the censorship directives, instructions issued by the Bureau de la Presse Militaire to newspaper editors and wire service journalists covering the Battle of Verdun from the first days of the German assault onward. They are not secret documents. They are institutional documents, produced by officials doing their jobs, using the language of their jobs. What they contain, in that flat administrative prose, is the editorial framework within which France was permitted to understand what was happening to its army in the Meuse Valley in 1916. The directives instructed newspapers that all coverage of Verdun must emphasize French resistance and heroism. Casualty figures were not to be published. Individual unit failures were not to be reported. The loss of specific positions, forts, villages, ridges, was to be described in language that conveyed temporary tactical adjustment rather than defeat. The word résistance héroïque appeared in multiple directives, with a repetitiveness that told you exactly what the government needed the population to believe. The directives weren't lying, exactly. French troops at Verdun were showing extraordinary resistance. Many acts of genuine heroism occurred. The problem was that the directives selected from the available reality with such consistent purpose that what emerged in French newspapers was not a version of Verdun, but a different place with the same name. A Verdun in which the French were always holding, always fighting back, always giving ground only temporarily, and always recovering it, in which the dead appeared only as the honored fallen, rather than as the product of institutional failures and strategic miscalculation. The French War Ministry's propaganda services launched illustrated magazines specifically tied to the Verdun battle in 1916. Publications with titles like La Défense de Verdun and La Guerre. Their pages filled with photographs approved through the Army's photographic censorship system. The photographs that appeared in these publications showed French soldiers advancing, French prisoners taken, French positions held. What they did not show was equally instructive. No photographs of the French dead. No images of shell-shock casualties being carried from the line. No pictures of the food arriving at forward positions in containers that also carried the smell of the gas shells fired 2 nights previously. The visual Verdun that French civilians experienced in their illustrated magazines bore a deliberate relationship to the actual Verdun. It was constructed from true elements, photographically accurate in each individual image, and collectively false in the picture it composed. This was not uniquely French. Every major belligerent in the First World War operated wartime censorship systems that performed essentially the same function, selecting from reality to produce a sustainable version of the war for domestic consumption. But what happened at Verdun specifically was that the censorship was not just managing information about a battle, it was constructing the founding narrative of a national myth in real time, while the battle was still happening, before anyone knew its outcome. By the spring of 1916, the French government and media establishment had already decided what Verdun meant. It meant unbreakable resistance. It meant France will not yield. It meant ils ne passeront pas. The meaning was fixed before the battle ended. Everything that happened subsequently, including the French recapture of lost ground in October and December, was read through that fixed meaning, rather than being allowed to produce its own. The myth-making had practical necessity behind it, and I want to be fair about that before criticizing it. France in 1916 was fighting for its survival as an independent state. The German army was inside French territory. Public will to continue the war was a military resource, as real and as necessary as artillery ammunition or replacement troops. A French government that had allowed accurate coverage of the battle's costs, the actual casualty figures, the fall of Fort Douaumont through institutional negligence, the inadequate gas masks, the failed relief attempts at Fort Vaux, the specific failures of planning and command that produced preventable deaths, would have been managing information about a situation far more damaging to public morale than the managed version. The censors weren't cynics. They were people who believed that France needed to win, that winning required public support, and that public support required a sustainable narrative. They were probably right on all 3 points. The problem came later. The post-war monumentalization of Verdun was a continuation of the wartime myth-making by other means. The Douaumont ossuary, designed by the architects Léon Azéma, Max Edré, and Jacques Hardy, following a design competition in the early 1920s, and inaugurated in 1932 by the French president Albert Lebrun, is one of the most architecturally extraordinary memorial structures in Europe. 46 meters tall, its central tower rising above a long cloister that contains the commingled bones of 130,000 unidentified soldiers. It commands the ridge above the battlefield with a deliberate assertion of permanence. The stained glass windows were designed by Georges de Vallière. The building projects heroic sacrifice in its every proportion. It is an argument, made in stone and glass, that the dead of Verdun died for something whose value was commensurate with their number. What the ossuary doesn't project, what its architecture doesn't permit you to see, is the full picture of how those men died and why. You cannot read, in the ossuary's proportions, the story of the stripped garrison of Fort Douaumont. You cannot see, in the stained glass, the government censorship directives. You cannot find, in the tower's shadow, the contested casualty figures, or the internal memo that said, "We are estimating." The ossuary is a powerful and genuine act of commemoration, and it is simultaneously a carefully designed argument about the meaning of the battle it commemorates. These two things are both true, and neither invalidates the other. But holding them simultaneously requires a kind of historical bifocal vision that is genuinely difficult to maintain while standing in front of a structure of that scale and that solemnity. The phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," as established in the previous chapter, was coined by General Nivelle, not Pétain, in a communiqué issued in June of 1916. It was attributed to Pétain because Pétain was the beloved commander, and because Nivelle's subsequent catastrophic failure at the Chemin des Dames in the spring of 1917, an offensive that killed tens of thousands of French soldiers in return for negligible gains, and triggered the largest mutiny crisis the French army faced in the entire war, made him an impossible founding father for the national story. The myth required a hero, and the hero had to be someone who deserved to have said it. So Pétain said it, and Nivelle didn't, and the plaques went up accordingly. And for a century, the misattribution has been reproduced in every language, on every memorial, in every documentary, in every school textbook on both sides of the Channel, including, for decades, official French ones. The Verdun myth had a specific and consequential afterlife. In the interwar years, the experience of Verdun, specifically the lesson that France had held by digging in, by building fortifications, by making the German advance prohibitively costly through prepared defensive positions, became central to the French army's strategic thinking. This thinking was institutionalized in concrete. The Maginot Line, that great complex of underground fortifications running along the Franco-German border, built between 1928 and 1936, at a cost of 7 billion francs, was among other things the Verdun lesson applied to the scale of a national frontier. If France could hold the German army by digging in at Verdun, it could hold it on the border by digging in everywhere. The logic was compelling. The problem was the Ardennes. Germany bypassed the Maginot Line in May of 1940 by advancing through the Ardennes forest, terrain that French military planners had assessed as impassable for mechanized forces and had therefore left lightly defended. They were wrong about the terrain, and wrong in a way that the Verdun lesson had made more likely rather than less. An army that had made defensive tenacity its primary virtue and had built that virtue into national concrete had not adequately maintained the intellectual flexibility to ask what would happen if the defense was in the wrong place. The Maginot Line worked. It was impregnable against frontal assault. The Germans went around it. Verdun had taught France to hold the ground that was chosen as the ground to hold. It had not taught France to choose the right ground. Me reading the Brill volume on photography and emotions at Verdun, which reconstructs the French War Ministry's visual propaganda apparatus in some detail, I kept noticing the gap between the chapter on censored images and the chapter on the ossuary's architecture. The people who designed the censorship directives and the people who commissioned the ossuary were not the same people, working 20 years apart from very different starting points. But they were solving the same problem. How do you make something this large, this costly, this morally complex, into something that a society can carry forward? The censors answered that question with selected photographs and approved language. The architects answered it with a tower 46 meters tall. Both answers were incomplete. Both were the best their creators could do with the materials available to them. That's not cynicism. That's just what it looks like when institutions try to process things that are too large to be processed. Chapter 15. The soil itself is the document. There is a specific quality to the edge of the Zone Rouge that no description quite prepares you for. You're walking through ordinary French countryside, fields, hedgerows, the kind of gentle Meuse Valley landscape that has been farmed continuously for 2,000 years. And then there's a tree line and a sign, and the ground on the other side of that tree line is different in a way that you notice before you can name what you're noticing. The trees are old and dense, the understory is sparse and wrong, and the ground surface isn't quite flat in the way that undisturbed forest floor is flat. There are depressions, not dramatic ones, shallow, regular, 10 or 15 meters across, softened by 100 winters but unmistakably not natural. The shell craters are still there, still visible. A century of rain and freeze-thaw and root growth has smoothed them, but not removed them. From the air, the Zone Rouge looks like the surface of the moon. The Zone Rouge, as it exists in 2026, is the product of two intersecting processes that have been running simultaneously since 1919. The first is the gradual reforestation of the battlefield. French authorities planted timber trees across much of the former battle zone beginning in the 1920s, partly to stabilize the disturbed soil, partly to create a managed landscape from what would otherwise have been an open wasteland. Those trees are now old-growth forest, a century of relatively undisturbed growth producing an ecosystem of unusual density and diversity. Wild boar, deer, 100 species of bird. The second process is chemistry, and it runs in the opposite direction from the ecological recovery. The arsenic in the Zone Rouge soil, measured in published geochemical studies at levels reaching up to 1,000 times the safe threshold for agricultural use in the most contaminated areas, is not staying in place. It is migrating, slow, through groundwater, into the broader Meuse watershed. The biology has recovered, the chemistry hasn't. The numbers in the contamination studies are the kind of numbers that require a specific effort of attention to hold. Lead concentrations in Zone Rouge soil, up to 1,000 times the safe threshold. Arsenic. Measurements in some areas at levels that prevent the establishment of young vegetation entirely, which is why the forest, for all its apparent recovery, has that sparse and strange understory. Zinc from the driving bands of artillery shells, elevated across the entire former battle zone at levels that accumulate in plant tissue and work their way up the food chain. The sources of the contamination are multiple. The metals from shell casings and bullets, obviously, but also the specific chemistry of the chemical munitions. The arsenic-based compounds from Blaukreuz and related agents, which decompose in soil moisture into inorganic arsenate that bonds to soil particles but remains biologically active for centuries. The chemical weapons deployed in 1916 are still releasing their active components into the soil in 2026. The chemistry of that year is still running. Of the estimated 60 million shells fired at Verdun across the 10 months of battle, approximately 15 million failed to detonate on impact, roughly 1 in 4. This dud rate, consistent with First World War artillery ammunition generally, has left an estimated 12 million kilograms of unexploded ordnance distributed through the Zone Rouge's soil. Every year, France's bomb disposal service, the Service de Déminage, recovers approximately 900 tons of this material from the former battle zone and surrounding agricultural land. This is the récolte de fer, the iron harvest, a term that farmers in the Meuse Valley have used for so long that it has lost whatever quality of dark irony it once carried and become simply descriptive. You plow and you stop when the blade hits metal. You stop the tractor. You flag the location. You call the démineur. Then, eventually, you continue. At 900 tons per year, the arithmetic of clearance is straightforward and merciless. Complete removal of the estimated 12 million kilograms of ordnance would require approximately 300 years at the current rate. France's Civil Security Authority estimates the upper bound at 700 years, accounting for the ordnance that current survey methods haven't yet located. 700 years. That places the Zone Rouge's final decontamination in approximately the year 2726. The First World War will still be happening, in a specific material sense, when every current government on Earth has been replaced by something that doesn't yet exist. There is a specific technical reason why century-old shells are not simply dangerous in the way that aged things are generally dangerous. Fragile, unreliable, their mechanisms degraded by time. The danger is in some cases the opposite. Shells filled with lyddite, picric acid, a high explosive widely used in First World War artillery ammunition, undergo a slow chemical reaction with the copper of the shell casing as the picric acid decomposes over decades. The product of this reaction is copper picrate, a compound that is significantly more sensitive to shock than the original picric acid explosive. A lyddite shell that has been in the ground for 100 years may be more likely to detonate from physical disturbance than a newly manufactured shell. The démineur training program specifically addresses this. The older the shell, the more carefully it must be handled, because the aging process has in some cases produced a secondary explosive more sensitive than the primary one. The battle is not just ongoing. In this specific technical sense, it is aging toward greater lethality. The 9 villages that died for France. Fleury devant Douaumont, Bézenvaux, Aumont-près-Samonieux, Cumières-le-Mort-Homme, Douaumont, Louvemont Côte du Poivre, Orne, and Vaux de Vendameloup, along with others in the wider zone, exist in the French administrative system as communes with zero permanent residents, appointed mayors, annual budgets, and legal designations that preclude resettlement without an act of the National Assembly. The legislation protecting them was passed in 1919. In 107 years, it has never been repealed. These places are maintained as absences by active legal and administrative effort. The French state allocates real money and real administrative attention to preserving the non-existence of places that have not existed since 1916. This is either the most extraordinary act of institutional memory in the modern world, or the most extraordinary act of institutional grief. Probably it's both, and probably the distinction doesn't matter. Aerial photographs of the Zone Rouge tell the contamination story more clearly than any soil assay table. The former village areas, Fleury, Douaumont village, the others, show as distinctive patches within the forest, their outlines still readable in the tree canopy, because the arsenic concentrations correlate precisely with the settlement patterns that preceded the battle, which concentrated the heaviest fighting and the densest shell impacts in and around the built-up areas. The village of Fleury appears in aerial photographs as a somewhat darker, somewhat less dense patch in the forest, roughly corresponding to the original cadastral footprint of the settlement. The village is legible from the air 100 years after it ceased to exist. The land remembers the shape of the buildings. I've stood at the edge of the Zone Rouge in late afternoon light and tried to find the right frame for what I was looking at. I'm not sure I succeeded. The forest is beautiful, genuinely, in the way that old forests are beautiful. The quality of light through old canopy, the bird sound, the animal tracks in the soft earth near the tree line, and in the same earth, at intervals that the surveys have mapped, but that your eye can't detect, are shells that will explode if disturbed, containing chemicals that are dissolving their casings and becoming more reactive as they dissolve, lying in soil contaminated to levels that would fail every environmental safety standard in every legal jurisdiction in the developed world. Beautiful and toxic, recovered and unrecovered, a living ecosystem growing in a chemical weapon. The Zone Rouge contains all of these things simultaneously, and no single frame holds them all. France spends approximately 4.5 million euros per year on Zone Rouge maintenance, bomb disposal operations in the Meuse sector, and the administrative costs of the 9 ghost communes. Across the 108 years since the armistice, this expenditure has accumulated to something in the range of €500 million in modern equivalent values. The battle stopped in December of 1916. The public expenditure it generates has never stopped. It is projected to continue for at minimum 300 more years, more likely 700. Verdun isn't finished. It's ongoing. The ground is the evidence, and the evidence isn't going anywhere. Chapter 16. Verdun, 1984. The Handshake at the Oshery. On the 22nd of September, 1984, 70 years after the start of the First World War, French President François Mitterrand and German Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl stood together in front of a catafalque at the entrance to the Douaumont Oshery. The catafalque, a draped ceremonial bier carrying no specific remains, a symbolic object rather than a physical one, was covered on one side with a German flag, on the other with a French flag. The two leaders stood for 2 minutes of silence. At some point during the silence, Mitterrand reached for Kohl's hand. Kohl took it. They stood, hand in hand, heads bowed, in front of the building that contains the commingled bones of 130,000 men their two countries had spent the preceding century trying to avoid discussing in the same sentence. The photograph that captured the moment became one of the most reproduced images in European political history. If you have seen one photograph associated with European post-war reconciliation, this is probably the one you've seen. The two men are in formal dark coats, their posture the posture of a ceremony that has moved beyond its planned sequence into something less managed. Cole is very large, Mitterrand is quite small. They are holding hands with an awkwardness that is somehow more convincing than grace would have been. Whether the handshake was spontaneous depends on which account you read. French eyewitnesses and French press accounts universally describe it as unplanned, an authentic gesture that emerged from the ceremony's emotional weight. German accounts, including Cole's own memoir, describe it as unplanned, while acknowledging that the protocol had specified that the two leaders would stand together during the 2-minute silence. The standing together was negotiated. The reaching for a hand was not, or at least not in any document that has been produced subsequently. The distinction matters in a particular way. If the handshake was genuinely spontaneous, it was an authentic human moment that happened to occur within a scripted ceremony. If it was somehow arranged, it was theatre. Most observers who have examined the evidence conclude that the ceremony was theatre, elaborate, meaningful, carefully negotiated theatre, and that within that theatre, something genuine happened. These categories aren't mutually exclusive. The best political rituals are usually both. The negotiations that preceded the ceremony are documented in German Foreign Ministry records and in the scholarly literature on Franco-German relations in the 1980s. What the negotiations reveal is the extent of the advance work required to produce a ceremony that both sides could attend without betraying their own constituencies. Specific questions required resolution. Would Cole lay a wreath at a French memorial or at a separate German memorial? Would German dead be explicitly acknowledged in the ceremony's language or subsumed into general references to the fallen of all nations? Would the ceremony take place at the ossuary, where German bones lie alongside French ones, or at a separate German cemetery? The last question was decided in favor of the ossuary, which meant that the ceremony's setting contained within it the evidence of a decision made in the 1920s that had, perhaps inadvertently, made 1984 possible. The decision to commingle French and German remains, rather than separate them, which meant that by 1984, 60 years of bones had made the question of whose memorial it was formally unanswerable. Veterans organizations on the French side were not unanimous about the ceremony. A minority position within the larger veterans community argued that treating French and German dead as equally to be mourned at a ceremony held on French soil, at a French national memorial, was historically inappropriate, that it erased the distinction between those who had fought to defend France and those who had attacked it. This argument was overridden by the Élysée, but it was publicly stated and it was recorded. The official historical narrative of the 1984 ceremony tends not to linger on this dissent, because it complicates the clean image of reconciliation. But the dissent was real, and understanding that it existed is part of understanding what the ceremony was actually doing. Not recording a completed reconciliation, but performing one, and using that performance as an instrument to push the reconciliation further toward completion. Ceremonies don't record states of affairs. They create them. Mitterrand understood this. So did Cole. The choice of Verdun, specifically, rather than any other First World War site, was made with deliberate symbolic precision. The Somme, where British and German dead lie in adjacent cemeteries, might have offered a less politically fraught setting. Ypres, where the Menin Gate carries the names of tens of thousands of men from both sides, was another possibility. But Verdun was chosen because Verdun was the French wound, the national sacred site, the place that had generated the defining myth of French military identity in the 20th century. For a German chancellor to stand at Verdun was not a neutral gesture. It was an acceptance of French grief on French terms. It was an acknowledgement, performed rather than stated, because performed acknowledgements are more durable than stated ones. That Germany bore a specific responsibility for what had happened on that ground. Coming to Verdun was Cole choosing to be present in the place that France had made the symbol of everything Germany had done to it. The ceremony was also, with complete explicitness, a political argument for European integration. 1 year before the Schengen Agreement, within the accelerating momentum of the European community's deepening, Verdun was being deployed as the founding image, the visual argument, for a political project. The logic was not complicated, and it wasn't disguised. This is what Europe looks like without integration. 700,000 casualties, and a poisoned landscape that will take 700 years to clear. The bones of 130,000 men in a building you can see from 3 kilometers away. 2 men holding hands over German and French remains that nobody can tell apart. This is the cost of the alternative. Build something different. Whether this was cynical depends on whether you think using history for political purposes is inherently cynical. I don't, and I'll say so directly. Using Verdun to argue for European integration in 1984 was an act of political honesty, because the argument was true. The bones in the ossuary are a real consequence of the thing that European integration was built to prevent. The ceremony used genuine grief to support a genuine argument. The packaging was theatrical and the preparation was diplomatic, and none of that changes the underlying reality that the argument rested on. The handshake was staged. The bones are real. There is one detail about the ossuary that the ceremony's imagery, for all its power, tends to obscure. The building is not simply a French national memorial. Approximately 30,000 of the unidentified remains it holds are German soldiers. They have been there since the 1920s, stored, in the absence of any other practical arrangement, alongside the French soldiers they had killed and been killed by. The ossuary, described universally in French memorial culture as a monument to French sacrifice at Verdun, contains roughly 1/4 German dead. Kohl and Mitterrand were holding hands over German bones as well as French ones. That detail isn't in the ceremony's program notes. It doesn't appear in the standard description of the building in tourist literature or memorial publications. It's simply true, available in the ossuary's own documentation, and quietly present in the structure itself. Visible through the small external windows in the lower wall, through which visitors can see the piled remains inside. The bones don't look French or German. They look like bones. Chapter 17. The Ground Still Speaks. Verdun in 2026. There is a sign at the entrance to the restricted section of the Zone Rouge, a simple municipal sign, the kind used to mark boundaries and restrictions across France, carrying the standard administrative language about prohibited access, the relevant legal article, the authority responsible. It is, in its way, the most extraordinary sign in Europe, because the restriction it marks is not temporary, not pending remediation, not subject to a scheduled review. It marks the edge of a piece of France that cannot be entered, built on, farmed or inhabited for the foreseeable future of any person alive today, and of their children, and of their children's children, and of a significant number of subsequent generations beyond that. The sign doesn't say any of this. It says in the neutral language of administrative France that access is restricted. The scale of the restriction is implicit in the chemistry of the soil on the other side. This is the last chapter, and it is the one where I'm going to drop the archival framing and speak directly. Not because the archives are exhausted. They aren't. A researcher could spend a lifetime in the primary sources for this battle and not reach the end of them. But because the series has a destination, and the destination is here, not in the past, but in the present, in what the ground of the Meuse Valley is doing right now, in 2026, under the feet of the wild boar and the bomb disposal teams and the forest wardens and the appointed mayors of 9 communes with no populations. The France that goes to work in the Zone Rouge every year is a very specific professional community. The démineurs of the Meuse department are specialists in a trade that didn't exist before 1919 and won't end. At any rate, no one living will see it end. They drive vehicles equipped to carry ordnance. They use specialist X-ray equipment to assess the contents of recovered shells before touching them. They learn in their training to treat every century-old shell as a specific and unpredictable object rather than a category. The picric acid chemistry, as described earlier in this series, means that old lyddite shells may be more dangerous than new ones. The démineurs know this. They handle the iron harvest accordingly. Since the armistice, over 1,000 people have been killed by unexploded ordnance from the First World War in France. Démineurs, farmers, construction workers, occasionally children. The number of annual fatalities has declined significantly over the century as safety protocols have improved and the density of discovery in the most heavily cleared areas has reduced. But the rate hasn't reached zero, and it won't reach zero until the ordnance is gone, which won't happen in the lifetime of anyone reading this. Every year, approximately 40 sets of human remains are recovered in the Verdun sector from construction work, agricultural activity, and forest management operations. The French Ministry of Defense runs an ongoing forensic identification program that uses DNA analysis matched against family registries. The identification rate runs at between 15 and 20%, meaning that in a good year, perhaps 8 or 10 of the 40 recovered individuals will be identified, their families notified, if those families still exist after more than a century, and formal burial conducted. The remaining 25 or 30 sets of remains go to the ossuary. The building continues to receive new inhabitants. It has been receiving them continuously since 1927. The 9 ghost communes maintain their legal existence through an administrative ritual that is by now so routine it has shed most of its original drama. The prefecture of the Meuse appoints a mayor for each commune. The mayor attends official functions, maintains records, submits an annual budget of a few thousand euros, and represents the commune in the regional administrative structure. The communes appear in all the relevant databases, contribute to regional statistics, and have the full legal apparatus of French communal governance applied to places where no one has lived since 1916. The law protecting them from resettlement was passed in 1919 and has never been amended. When I look at these facts in sequence, I find I can't maintain any single emotional register toward them. They're funny and they're terrible. They're absurd and they're the most serious possible response to what happened in these places. They are France refusing, in the specific language of administrative law, to pretend that the war ended cleanly. The contamination research being published in the most recent peer-reviewed geochemistry literature, studies using updated soil sampling and groundwater analysis across the Zone Rouge and its surrounding areas, is not reassuring. The arsenic migration through the groundwater system is measurable, directional, and ongoing. Independent academic studies consistently describe the contamination as underestimated in government assessments, and describe the contamination front as moving outward from the most heavily affected areas at a slow but consistent rate. The French Environmental Agency ADEME maintains that the contamination is contained and stable. The academic literature, published in journals like Science of the Total Environment, uses different language. This is a genuine scientific dispute with policy consequences. If the government assessment is correct, the Zone Rouge can be managed indefinitely at current cost and current risk. If the independent researchers are correct, the contamination is expanding into areas currently classified as safe, and the effective footprint of the battle is still growing more than a century after it ended. The ecocide discussion. The ongoing international legal debate about whether large-scale, permanent environmental destruction caused by warfare should be recognized as an international crime alongside war crimes and crimes against humanity has been running through the International Criminal Court's Assembly of States Parties in some form since the early 2020s. The Zone Rouge is cited explicitly in much of the academic literature supporting the ecocide proposal as a historical baseline case. A defined area, a documented cause, a permanent consequence, a measurable ongoing harm that crosses all of the thresholds that any serious legal definition of ecocide would need to satisfy. The battle that produced it was not an outlier of industrial warfare. It was its most complete expression. And the legal framework being constructed in The Hague in 2026 to address similar consequences in contemporary conflicts is being calibrated against chemistry that was set in motion in a French forest in the spring of 1916. I've tried, across this series, to hold several things simultaneously. The specific human stories, the institutional failures, the industrial scale, the contested archives, the ongoing science. Verdun doesn't yield to any single frame, which is why it has generated so many. The heroic myth, the statistical horror, the ecological crime, the memorial sacred site, the diplomatic instrument, the unfinished battlefield. Every one of these frames captures something true. None of them alone captures enough. The man with the pressed violet in his diary and the soil assay showing arsenic at 1,000 times safe levels are both real, both part of the same event, and they require different kinds of attention that don't sit easily together. What I keep coming back to, in the end, is the sign at the Zone Rouge's edge. Not the chemistry behind it, not the legal history, not the statistics of clearance, just the sign itself, a piece of painted metal on a post, doing the ordinary work of marking a boundary. On one side of the boundary, France. Farms, roads, the D1916 with its commemorative name. The tourists arriving at the ossuary car park, the children reading the information boards. On the other side, 100-year-old forest growing in a century-old chemical weapon, the craters still readable in the canopy, the shells ticking through their slow chemistry toward greater sensitivity, the bones still distributed through the soil at every depth the plow can reach. The sign marks the limit of what a functioning society can absorb and continue to function. The ground behind it is the honest answer to the question of what industrial warfare actually costs. Not in money, not in years, not even in lives, in chemistry, in the permanent alteration of the land, in the inheritance left to people who had no say in what was buried there. The Battle of Verdun was 302 days long. It ended on the 18th of December, 1916. It generated public expenditure that has continued without interruption since 1919, and will continue, at minimum, for 300 more years. It killed, we estimate, we do our best with the numbers, somewhere between 300,000 and more than 300,000 people, depending on which count you accept, in a range of disagreement that encompasses more human beings than many countries contain. It poisoned a piece of France so thoroughly that France has given up on the idea of cleaning it within any human time frame, and decided instead to fence it and monitor it and wait. It produced a myth so powerful that the myth shaped the military doctrine that led, in 1940, to the fall of France. It produced a photograph of two men holding hands over bones that helped build a political union of 500 million people. It's still happening. That's the point. The chemistry is still running. The bones are still surfacing. The shells are still degrading toward greater sensitivity in their acid-dark beds under the forest floor. The dead are being identified, one by one, at 15 to 20% per year, and the ossuary is still growing. The Zone Rouge still has a sign on it, and the sign is still correct. That is what it costs. Not what it cost, what it costs. Present tense, ongoing. The ground is the document, and the ground is not finished speaking.